Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if villain Toga is obsessed with hero Izuku, Deku x Toga, part 2. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, Nanocowie, link is in the description, and also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the story. Most of Class A had moved on from the trauma of the villain's assault on their summer camp, despite the various injuries taken. Cuts, bruises, gas damage, and a couple broken bones, but it appeared that the decision to allow them to use their quirks had mitigated most of the damage. At first many of them were saddened by the loss of Mineta, perhaps unsuspiciously lacking any female participants in the grieving, but most of them had decided to allow the pros to handle the investigations into his whereabouts. But Izuku had been affected on a slightly different level than most, not primarily for the loss of his classmate, but the loss of a friend. Izawa had come under a lot of flack for allowing Mineta to get kidnapped, and Izuku was glad that Bakugo hadn't been the one they had managed to get. They could only imagine the kind of hellfire the school would come under if Bakugo got kidnapped after his display during the sports festival. Instead, Izuku was mourning the loss of Ragdoll who still hadn't been found. As they were packing up and onto the bus to head home, Izuku could see Pixie Bob crying on Tora's shoulder while Mandalay looked on, helpless to ease her friend's anguish. The feeling had gnawed away at him ever since, leaving him with the only option of training to keep his mind off things. That's what led him to be out in UA's pool facility, quickly moving forward with his speed and durability. He had found the feeling oddly cathartic after a while, and could be seldom seen not in the water or on the poolside and training. Inko had been slightly worried that the fight had been too hard on him, but he had assured her that it wasn't anything self-destructive. Izuku had even pointed to another hobby that he took up, admittedly he did it at the poolside, but a hobby nonetheless, the guitar. Izuku had found it under his bed when they were packing up, drawing curious stares from the girls, and in particular Jiro. The sight of it was oddly comforting to him, so he resolved himself to being the best he could at it for when Ragdoll was saved. He bought a case for it and brought it with him whenever he went to the pool to train, strumming out a couple songs whenever he was burned out. Another surprise was the fact that Izawa seemed to come down and relax by the pool while Izuku had trained. At first the teacher claimed it was so that he could get some time away from his colleagues, but eventually he stopped qualifying it like that and just enjoyed his time in the sun. Izuku had been looking at the man in a new light after seeing him with Mandalay. The way he acted seemed like he wasn't always this way. It was a week after the training camp incident when Izawa spoke up of his own volition, a rare event outside of the classroom. Midoriya, we have tracked down the location of Mineta and Ragdoll. Izuku floundered in the water for a moment before calming down and getting out of the pool. He looked over at his teacher in shock while asking, "Why are you telling me this, sir? Is it allowed?" Izawa shook his head as he sat up and leaned against the wall, his eyes shadowed by his hair. "No, it really isn't allowed, but Mandalay asked me to tell you this. Apparently you and Ragdoll became quite close friends during your training, and she wanted me to tell you that she was allegedly alive. It also pertains to another situation we have on our hands." Izuku was still reeling from the fact that his teacher had actually broken the rules for a woman, especially something this sensitive. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what happened between you and Mandalay?" Izawa sighed and rubbed his forehead, staving off the emotions which were threatening to flow from his eyes. "Guess it couldn't hurt. It all started in UA, back in my first year." Flashback. A young Izawa sighed as he looked at the amount of requests he got from different hero agencies, going through each one meticulously. His performance at the sports festival was phenomenal, being a massive player in the tournament as he completely negated most of his opponents and stomped them. Eventually he managed to choose one that seemed uninteresting enough and out of the way, Nero, run by the fox hero Kitsune. He saw that they focused on underground rings and rescuing people from human trafficking rings, enough to stay away from the public eye. Once he had handed in his application, the day went just as normal as usual, the annoying bug that now called himself Present Mick, making himself a nuisance, being obnoxious as usual, and the rest of his class going through the paces. He finished his work, went home, cooked himself dinner, and slept. After a couple more days of this, the new week had arrived, bringing with it the hero internship week. His teacher brought them to the train station, handed them their tickets, and made them swear that they would represent the US well. Izawa never paid attention to him though, instead taking the opportunity to scan over Class 1A. There were the usual gaggles of people chattering like usual, making themselves a general nuisance while moving to their respective trains, but one girl in particular stood out to him. She was in a group with a blonde girl whose voice seemed to grate on his ears more than he could imagine, and a green-haired girl who appeared to have a screw or two loose, but there was something ethereal about the short-haired brunette with them. Brushing off the feeling, Izawa took his ticket and boarded the train to the south of Tokyo. Hoisting his bag onto the luggage rack above him with little effort, he took a seat and surveyed what was happening. Nobody else from his class were going down the same way, perfect by his standards, but to his dismay the girl he had spotted earlier along with her annoying and crazy friend boarded the train themselves. Aizawa didn't think they could get much louder if they tried, but tuned them out as best he could as he tried to grab a couple winks of sleep. 5 minutes later he was beginning to contemplate either jumping off the train or murdering that God's forsaken woman. Shota opened his eyes and glared at her like she had just spilled coffee on his bed, subconsciously activating his quirk. She didn't seem to notice the holes being bored in her head though, instead continuing to chat loudly with the green-haired girl. He was broken from his reverie by an apologetic voice ringing out in his head. "Sorry about Ryuko, by the way your quirk is active." Shota whipped his head around to try and find a source of the voice before seeing the girl he had been so enamored with smirking at him from across the aisle. The voice rang out in his head again, this time with both of their eyes locked. "This is my quirk, telepath. I'm able to speak to you with my thoughts, but you're unable to respond so don't bother." He nodded at her before breaking eye contact and looking down at his shoes once more. They kept in silence like that for another couple of minutes before the train stopped and both the blonde girl and the both got up and off of the train while saying goodbye to their friend. Shota couldn't help but let out a small sigh of relief, which was obviously picked up by the girl across from him. "Oh don't worry, we're making this commute all week." He looked up at her again, this time with her speaking physically instead of using her quirk. Honestly Shota wasn't that interested in a conversation, but anything was preferable to the incessant chatter of those two. "You don't seem to be the type to hang around with them, what gives?" The girl scoffed and leaned back against the window, stretching out her back as she replied. "Ryuko and Tomoko are alright once you get used to them, and I had plenty of time to do just that in middle school. The name's Shino Sasaki, yours?" Shota looked down at his feet, a small dusting of red covering his cheeks as he responded quietly. "Shota Aizawa." They sat in silence after that, Shino's eyes looking up and down at him like a piece of meat while Shota tried to ignore the feeling. Eventually they reached his stop and he got up, but what he didn't expect was her following suit. They both blinked at each other as Shota shook his head and grabbed his bag, walking off the train as she looked at him inquisitively. The walk to Nero was a relatively short one, with a few twists and turns until Shota found himself in front of a dingy-looking building in an alleyway. As he was looking up and down the building, he heard a cough behind him. Spinning around he saw that girl, Shino if he remembered correctly, holding up her hand in greeting. "Hey Aizawa, small world eh?" Shota did his best to ignore her as he pushed into the agency, hearing a small bell toll to announce his entry. Shino followed after him, slightly put off by his lack of reply. They saw their assigned hero meditating on a bench, looking up to nod at them. Shota put Shino out of his mind, determined not to let her interrupt his week of experience. They didn't talk much for the rest of the week, giving small greetings to each other in the morning on their commute. But after that they seemed to always bump into each other again, be it at the nurse's office, Shino greeting him in the morning or at lunch, or even getting paired for inter-class activities. By the end of their time at UA, Shota could honestly call her his best friend, possibly even a confidant in some cases. Ryuko and Tomoko, as he had come to know them, had initially been skeptical of him, but were smart enough not to question Ryuko's decision on her friendship with him under threat of her wealth. But the tipping point in their friendship had been when he was cornered by Shino at the end of their time at UA. It was just the two of them in the stairwell. The majority of the student base had already left for the summer, leaving just the two of them alone in Class 3A. There the offer to join Shino, Ryuko, Tomoko, and Yuara in a hero team sponsored by Tomoko's wealthy parents was made, which he ultimately declined. At first there were tears, but Shino had come to understand that teamwork and Aizawa just didn't work, and it was a fact. After that, she hugged him around the waist before being carted off to begin her new job in the mountains. Then flashback. They sat in silence for a minute or two as Aizawa wiped away his tears, Izuku nearly following suit from the tale. It was obvious that the life of a hero must mean sacrifices, but the tale had struck a chord in the young student as he understood why his teacher seemed to be so bitter sometimes. Eventually Aizawa stood up and said, "This doesn't leak to anyone, okay? Just so you know, that Himiko girl is going to be stopping by UA tomorrow to take some blood from you under guarded escort. She's been making progress to recovery, but she refuses to accept reform without you being involved. See you around Midoriya." Aizawa walked away and out of the pool area as Izuku got in the pool and floated on his back, digesting everything he was told. The whole thing seemed alien, like Izuku had suddenly stumbled into someone's deluded fantasy where everything he knew was topsy. He heard a small cough to his side and saw an unexpected face. The girl was sitting with his guitar in her lap, inspecting every nook and cranny of it. She heard her name being called and looked up, smirking at Izuku. "Hey Midoriya, how's it hanging?" Izuku maneuvered himself in the water for a bit, letting him look at her directly. "I'm okay." How long have you been here? She nonchalantly gestured down to her swimsuit, a conservative one piece that seemed to shout shyness. Long enough to hear the teacher's tale. Eye-opening shit, right? He nodded, dreading the conversation he would be having with Aizawa when he learned that Jiro knew, as well. She seemed to catch onto this, as she patted the poolside next to her. Don't worry Midoriya, I won't let it slip if you don't. So, what's the story with this beauty? Getting up and out of the water, Izuku sat down next to her, shaking his hair and getting her covered in water. I found it at the training camp when the guys and I went out to have a bonfire. Apparently there's a finders keepers policy there, so I gotta keep it. Jade decided to keep at it too, you know, well. Jiro grimaced at being covered in water before playfully splashing up at him with her feet dangling in the water. You guys got a bonfire, man, wish I could have been there too. You know, it gets kinda boring with only Wattbrain to talk to. It's like all he can talk about is being a hero, kinda weird. Wait, what was I supposed to tell you? Ah damn it, it's gone. Izuku did his best to deflect the water being splashed up at him by a grinning Jiro as he asked. How do you figure it out? She relinquished her assault for a moment as she began to strum out a fast-paced melody that sounded quite aggressive, a sound Izuku couldn't replicate. Well, nobody's gonna be popular without being interesting, right? Iida's kinda like a medieval knight, Mina's got the flirty playful look going for her, and I've got the music to back me up. I kinda worry for the guy, he's not going to have it too easy later on. The idea had left Izuku feeling slightly contemplative as he kicked his feet slowly in the water. He had never considered how popular he was going to be in all honesty, or even how he would become popular. Jiro smiled knowingly at him as she dropped the guitar to the side and jumped into the water. Come on lil Deku. Daylight's burning and we're still standing around. Izuku joined her in the water with a laugh, joining her for a game of pool tag where she seemed to be more concerned with splashing him at every chance than tagging him back. The day soon turned to afternoon and Jiro seemed to notice this with a frown. Damn it, I've gotta head to Izuku. Wait a minute, that's what it was. So hear me out, Momo, Uraraka, Mina, and I were all planning on getting together for a study session to catch up on everything before the new term started. You mind coming along and helping us out with ethics? He nodded, not really thinking much of it as he watched her grin at him. Thanks man, I'll see you around. She walked away to the girls' changing room and Izuku walked over to the boys. The day had been much more fun than he had remembered and he felt as if that guitar was much more meaningful than it was at the start. Once he was changed, his backpack was on his back and the guitar was in its case. He was about to go when he heard a cough. Turning to the entrance, he saw All Might standing there in his non-beefed form. Hey Midoriya, enjoy the company of your classmates I see. Izuku blushed as he shook his head violently. No, I mean yes, I mean. He cut him off with a laugh. Ha. Just messing with you my boy. Anyways, I wanted to talk to you about that villain you helped to detain and her future. Izuku sobered up quite a bit after that. Himiko was always a contentious topic in his head. Sure, she was nice if a little crazy, but she was still a villain, but she had surrendered. What about her? All Might took a seat on one of the benches and sighed, pulling one of his locks of hair out of his eye. You did a good deed for her, something many villains haven't seen a lot of. I've seen the deepest step someone can achieve, but somehow you were able to help her out of that. I know you haven't been allowed to see her, but I have, and her progress has gone incredibly fast. You must realize that, as her savior, you have a responsibility to her to make sure that she never finds herself in that situation again. This video should show you everything you need to know about the next stage in her recovery. He pulled out his phone and brought up a video file before handing it over to his disciple. Izuku took it and started the playback, his features reddening with every sentence spoken. Himiko was in the middle of a room, her arms bound to a chair, as a doctor asked her. Himiko Toga, it's time to start your reformation program. Are you ready? She seemed to pout as she bounced up and down in her chair. Yeah. But I'm not going through with it without my future husband Izuku. Without him, I'm gonna go crazy again. The researcher could be seen rubbing his head, staving off the frequent headaches he had started having when he first began treating this patient. Sigh. Okay, I give up, we'll get you your boyfriend. Who is he, and where do we find him? The video ended and Izuku shakily handed the phone back to All Might. Now do you see what must be done, young Midoriya, the burden you must bear? The air was still until the face of a beefed-up All Might appeared right in front of him yelling. You must smash through the walls of her heart and claim her for your own. For the sake of heroism. Claim her, young Midoriya, pierce through her heart with your fist. Claim her. Izuku couldn't have run out of that changing room any faster, All Might chasing him out of the door while yelling various things that would have gotten him arrested in some countries. All of this left Jiro standing at the gate of UA, looking at the seemingly deranged All Might chasing after Izuku while yelling claim her. He ain't talking about me, right? Time skip, next day. Izuku walked through the doors of UA's main building, trying his best to keep the rain from soaking him too bad. The walk had started out nice and sunny, but summer seemed to have other plans, as it sent a quick rainstorm to ruin his plans. Since he was already close to the building, and All Might telling him that Himiko needed blood today, he decided to just head in, even if there was no swimming to be done that day. As he shook his hair dry, he felt a vibration in his pocket. Pulling out his phone and swiping open the messaging app, he saw All Might's message. "You still coming in today, kid? Your future bride is awaiting you." Sighing, as he remembered last night, hours spent lying awake thinking about Himiko thanks to his mentor's deluded claims. He quickly typed back that he was already in the building, and All Might told him to meet them in Class 1A. Walking up to the aforementioned room, feeling slightly disconcerted at the empty halls, he saw a familiar face outside of the door. Detective Tsukauchi. The plain-looking man turned his head to smile at Izuku. "Ah, Mr. Midoriya, it's good to see you. Your girlfriend is waiting." Izuku blushed heavily at the man's teasing smile and quickly stammered out a denial, to which the detective said, "Don't worry about it, it's been a bit of a gag in the force ever since we got her statement. You've got one hell of a fangirl." Refusing to sigh in relief, Izuku followed him inside and saw All Might beefed up, 4 armed guards with tasers, along with a fidgety Himiko. She immediately perked up when she saw him and began to struggle against the restraints in an attempt to get to him. "Aizu. Come on, Mama's been missing you." None of the armed guards could contain their snickers as Izuku hid behind his hands. Tsukauchi pushed him forward and said, "Do your thing, kids. We'll be outside, use protection, and all that." The guards couldn't contain their full-blown laughter as they all trooped out of the room. All Might began to boast about the importance of taking care of a maiden before Tsukauchi pushed him outside, before Izuku could raise the global temperature by a couple degrees with his blush. Once they were alone, it was mostly silent, the only sound being the ruffling of Himiko in her restraints. Izuku coughed awkwardly as he walked forward to her, the act being slightly more questionable than usual with her in handcuffs. "So how's therapy?" Himiko couldn't contain her laughter as she laid down on the desk she was sitting on. "Smooth one, bet you use that on all the ladies. More importantly though, when the hell am I getting out of this?" The air was silent as she genuinely seemed saddened by her loss of freedom, causing Izuku to realize just how hard the decision to turn herself over really was. She could have continued killing just happily, but she consciously wanted to reform even if it meant jail time. Sighing, Izuku walked forward and sat next to her, the desk creaking ominously under their weight. He noticed that the desk actually belonged to Mineta and smiled. "I know it's hard, but think about it. Once you're free, you could do anything. You could become a chef, a model, or even a hero. I bet that the UA would accept you, maybe we could be in the same class." She looked up at him from being laid down, her eyes wide. "Sappy stuff aside. A chef, that's what you envision for me?" Gulping heavily before putting all of his confidence into his next sentence, Izuku said words that may well have sealed his fate. "Well, I think you would be quite cute baking." The air went still as Toga's grin grew wider with every second. Sitting up to be next to him, she clambered onto his lap as she huskily said, "So you want to see me in your kitchen, waiting eagerly for your heroic return every night so you can whisk me away?" Izuku gulped as she held the position for a while before bursting out into laughter which sounded like bells. "Ha. Man, you look so vulnerable like that, you can be so cute sometimes. Anyways, Mama needs her blood, so arm up, buddy." He dutifully held up his wrist as she swiveled around into the position she was in the forest. Izuku braced himself and put it against her lips so she could bite down. A small stab of pain was felt as her canines broke skin and vein, letting the blood flow into her mouth. After about 7 minutes she finished her meal and broke away, tooth and lip stained red. "Man, you have no idea how great it feels to have an on-demand tap of blood all to myself. You really do know how to make a girl feel special. By the way, Aizu, little Aizu seems to like me too." Izuku yelped as he noticed his little problem while Toga laughed again, obviously not being too bothered by the feeling. Getting up and off his lap, she dropped down into the chair and licked her lips. "Thanks for that. Anyways, you should probably hear this." He sat down at his desk right across from her as she leaned forward as if they were gossiping. "What is it?" She smiled before her face fell, becoming slightly more worried if he guessed right. "Well, I just wanted to tell you that the rescue is going to be a lot harder than you could imagine. You see, they have this boss man who we called Senpai, and he could be the end of All Might if they tried hard enough. I'm telling you this because I know that girl, you know, the green-haired pretty kitty. Well, she needs to be evacuated as fast as possible from the fight before she gets caught in the crossfire. They're heading to Kamino Ward, in a building on 6th Street where the Nomu are being made apparently. Izuku, I don't know what you see me as, but I see you as the best chance I have to try another life, where my quirk isn't the only thing that makes my choices for me." I gave the location of our base to the heroes, so I might actually be able to join you in the UA, but I know you want to help as many people as possible, so be there at 6 PM tonight to get her way. Please, don't die." Izuku reached over and wrapped his arms around her, not remembering the blood pouring from his wrist. "Thanks Toga, and I know that Tomoko will appreciate it too. I'll make sure she gets out safe, and I'm sure Mineta would be safe too. Who knows? Tomoko is a good psychoanalyst, maybe she could be your therapist and we can get you better together." She nodded into his shoulder, enjoying the embrace that she was so unfamiliar with. Eventually they got up and walked out, putting Himiko back into the custody of the police. As they walked away, Toga blowing a quick kiss his way, as they did so, All Might turned to him in his real form. "Midoriya, I want to tell you that Nezu has already set up young Himiko as a member of UA. We will host her here, acting as a student until she obtains her hero license and becomes a successful member of society. Now then, let's talk about what she told you in there." Izuku's heart stopped and sweat began to form on his forehead. Was he going to demand that he didn't go to Kamino, put him under arrest, have him tied down with Himiko to make sure they didn't go? "I knew you could do it. She is completely besotted with the idea of being your bride." Izuku turned to All Might in shock, now seeing him standing there buffed up with a leaflet depicting All Might and Midnight naked, with large question marks covering their privates being held up by Nezu. Along the top of the leaflet were the words, "A Guide to Safe Smashing. The UA Official Sex Education Leaflet. Now young Midoriya, it is time for your sexual academia to begin. Read this." He seemed to halt at seeing that Izuku had bolted off into the distance, frowning. "It is not good for a young man to be unaware of the ways of the world. I shall have to have Recovery Girl explain it to him on his next visit." As Izuku began to walk towards the pool, realizing that the sun had come out again, he thought back to the image of Midnight on that leaflet. "I hope Mineta never sees that leaflet, he won't show up to class all week. I wonder how he's doing." Meanwhile, with Mineta. Tamura never thought he would have this much trouble from a hero, maybe All Might, but not a student like this one. The news that they didn't have Bakugo was bad enough, but when Mr. Compress had revealed the goddamn monster that they had captured, he had carefully arranged each and every one of his hands to be pointing a middle finger at the magician. At first it was the crying, then the frenzied small talk, but now it was the whining. The little purple-haired rat wouldn't stop complaining and only shut up when he threatened to decay his balls off, the details of which balls in particular being left in the air. But that wasn't to last, causing Tamura to remember a game he had played many moons ago about a gang of mercenaries on another planet and a song featured in it. "Ain't no rest for the wicked." How fucking apt. The molesting midget's latest line of complaining had been the worst so far. Come on. I mean, how can you have a villains group without any hot babes serving your drinks? Seriously, if I were in charge of this joint I would have made a promise for everyone to get at least one hot babe for themselves. But even still, the goddamn stupidity of the situation had only escalated when the master had heard of some of the kids' policies. "Ah, a valid point young Mineta. Tamura, may I suggest you add that to your to-do list? It would be prudent to increase our standing. I shall have Jiren procure some employees if it is a problem." It got even worse when he saw Compress begin to nod, stroking his chin contemplatively. Yes, a magician does need his assistant after all. May I suggest that young Mineta have multiple assigned to him? It would be fair should he join us, as a reward for coming up with the idea. All for one hummed in contemplation. I suppose it would be only fair. Of course, we would need to fix your base up to accommodate a doubling in numbers. We would also need to provide them with suitable wages, not to mention dental plans. That was it, the tipping point for Tamura, as he decayed the entire bar in a single moment. You goddamn idiots. I can't believe that we, the most feared villain organization in Japan, are even talking about this. You haven't even considered bathroom hours or a new internet plan to accommodate double the users. Alright everyone, grab a pen and paper. We're the goddamn League of Villains, and I'm not standing for a goddamn half-assed attempt at getting whores for all of us. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Izuku awkwardly made his way through the brightly lit street of Kamino Ward, trying his best to ignore the sight of less moderately dressed men and women displaying their affection for each other. Today was the day when the fight was supposed to kick off, and the day Toga had told him where he needed to be if he wanted to help Ragdoll. Inko hadn't said anything as he announced his departure, giving a small wave and a worried smile as he walked through the door. He half expected Aizawa to be there to stop him from going, but the teacher was nowhere to be seen. Eventually he made his way off the main street and onto 6th, this time keeping his eyes on groups of drunkards making their ways past. He was just dressed in light clothes, perfect if he wanted to get away fast, but not as comforting as his hero attire. As he peered around the corner he could make out the building, an old decrepit office block which stood out as being unused among the others. Honestly, his heart rate was through the roof as he envisioned the millions of different ways this could go, and he could only envision one in which he survived. Checking the street again, he made sure that nobody was there before quietly creeping across the street to the small alleyway between the decrepit office building and a hobby shop. Sighing in relief that he hadn't been caught yet, Izuku tried to peer into the window of the office building to no avail. Kicking himself for forgetting that it would be dark by now, he weighed up his options before settling on the one which made the most sense in his fear-addled brain. That option. Fuck it. Climbing up onto the windowsill, Izuku pried it open, one for all, making the task facile, as the entire plastic frame including the glass popped out. Dropping it down onto a pile of trash, he wiggled his way through the new hole, dropping down onto the basement floor. Dusting himself off, he took a look around, gasping at what he saw now that his eyes were adjusted. Rows of Nomus, large ones-to-ones with wings, lined up in tanks like the world's deadliest aquarium. It was nearly enough to make him scarper, but the idea of Ragdoll being left in the crossfire was too terrifying to him. Izuku took a moment to compose himself before looking around, investigating for any clues to his friend's whereabouts. After a couple of minutes he found her, but her condition was enough to make his breath hitch. Unconscious, beaten, and bruised, she was roughly tied down onto a chair, her hair matted and dirty, while her clothes were in a terrible state. He was about to run forward to get to her, but he heard a large bang as the forward wall was broken by a massive fist. Quickly hiding behind a Nomu tank, Izuku watched as My Lady, Tora, and Best Jeanist flooded into the room, taking down any of the Nomu who began to cause trouble. Izuku watched as Tora ran forward and grabbed Ragdoll, ripping apart the ropes that bound her before carrying her out in his arms. Sighing in relief, Izuku was about to make a run for it before he heard footsteps, ones not of the heroes that had arrived. Cold, mechanical laughter echoed throughout the room as Izuku saw Best Jeanist become alert. The next words chilled him, and the sound of gathering energy filled his ears. "Hello heroes, do keep a seat warm for me in hell." It was then when he saw the Nomus begin to disappear, swallowed by grey liquid which had erupted from their mouths. The crackling energy reached a peak, letting out a high-pitched squeal, as Best Jeanist just managed to throw his companions out of the way before the blast engulfed him. The sickening scream that erupted from Best Jeanist shook Izuku to his core. It was over as quickly as it began, but the destruction was devastating. The entire office had been destroyed, along with most of the street beyond. Tora coughed out the dust which had made its way into his lungs and demanded from the villain. "What have you done to young Tomoko, you fiend?" The masked man chuckled, fixing his suit while saying nonchalantly. "Why, her quirk was quite unique, and I simply had to have it. You should have seen her, crying like an infant when she realized her loss." Izuku froze. This couldn't be all for one. The revelation shook him deeply as he tried to formulate a plan. Tora and Mount Lady were knocked unconscious with a mere snap of the fingers, leaving the bodies of all four heroes lying on the ground. All for one looked around at the bodies with disinterest, seemingly measuring up if he should waste his time with their quirks, when he heard a boom echo throughout the newly formed battlefield. "Hold it right there. It's smashing time." Izuku watched from behind the rubble as All Might landed in the crater, making a smaller one in the center of it all. The two enemies exchanged words, a few quips and insults thrown before the fighting began. Massive punches were thrown, large blasts of energy were shot, hundreds of millions in property damage to some people. It was for all intents and purposes awesome. But it was obvious that All Might was holding back, and Izuku could see why. Mount Lady, Tora, Ragdoll, and Best Jeanist were all still in the battlefield, their faces down and obviously unconscious, despite the fight going on. But the sight that motivated Izuku the most to act was the sight of a smile. The smile on the face of All Might as he faced his foe without quarter. That smile was the one he vowed to wear himself. Bracing himself, he charged one for all into his body and let it take hold. He could get to them in a second, gather them in 5, get them away in 8. If he timed this just right, then he should manage to pull it off. He waited for the perfect moment of distraction, and then it came in the form of an old man flying in. Gran Torino burst into the fray, kicking All for One in the face as he was about to deal a massive blow to All Might. Steeling himself, Izuku rushed forward. All eyes turned to him for a moment as he reached the bodies, grabbed all of them with 2 to each arm before jumping away over the rubble. All for One held up a finger to deliver a blow, but the distraction Izuku had caused was enough for All Might to sock him dead in the face, sending the villain crashing to the ground. That was all Izuku needed to get them to safety, getting them a few hundred meters from the fight in a couple of minutes. Once they were safe, he collapsed to his knees, the strain of carrying all 4 bearing down on him now that the adrenaline had subsided. He heard a coughing and turned his head to see Mount Lady getting up, rubbing her head which had a large dark bruise swelling on it. What happened? She turned her head and noticed that Izuku was also lying there, panting for breath. "Hey, wait, you're that kid from Shota's party. Midoriya, right?" Izuku nodded, as best he could while still panting. Mount Lady smiled at him, a little bit of blood running down from the corner of her mouth. You got us out of there, right? Thanks, kid, you did the right thing by getting us out of there. What's the situation? Izuku was about to reply when he heard a cough from behind him, interrupting his thoughts. Well then, it looks like someone decided to play hero tonight. I sure do love a little go-getter, don't you, Mandalay? He turned his head and saw Pixie Bob and Mandalay standing there in uniform, along with a bunch of medical staff. They all began to put the unconscious people on stretchers while attending Mount Lady's wound, as Mandalay began to admonish Izuku. What the hell were you thinking, kid? Do you know what kind of trouble you and Shota could get into for this? He smiled at her unnoticed inserting of Mr. Izawa into her concern. I'm sorry, Ms. Mandalay, but I don't regret a thing. A friend asked me to do this, and I'm not going to apologize for saving Ragdoll. She deflated when she noticed that a reprimand wasn't going to do any actual reprimanding. Well, I guess I can't fault you for that. But now, a public news helicopter saw you during the rescue. More likely than not, you're going to have to spend a couple dozen hours of community service before the dogs will be happy. But now that's out of the way. Izuku was caught off guard by the woman leaning down and gripping him in a hug. Thank you for saving Tomoko, she spoke very highly of you. He just awkwardly rubbed her back, not knowing what to do before she released him. Eventually the medical staff checked him over before giving him a clean bill of health and releasing him into police custody. As a rookie officer led him back to the makeshift base for the police, he was greeted by the grim smiles of Tsukauchi, Sansa the officer, and Mineta Sup Midoriya, how's it hanging? Izuku ran forward to greet his classmate, the officer behind him calling out to him in vain. Mineta. Are you alright? That was when he noticed that the boy was shaking, almost imperceivable. Yeah, but I don't think I'm cut out for this kind of stuff, you know. Maybe I should just go into volleyball, or fashion, or… The short boy began to ramble off on a tangent about different career paths, as Tsukauchi sighed, putting a small soaked rag over the boy's mouth and nose and letting him fall over unconscious. He's been like that since we managed to recapture him. It's quite possible that his hero days are over. Anyways, nice to see that the stain incident taught you a lesson, Midoriya. Izuku cringed at the disapproving stare, not offering any retort to it. Sansa stepped forward and handed Tsukauchi a tablet, showing what appeared to be a chart. Look, I don't set the laws, but I enforce them. The offense of a hero in training, without a license, performing heroic work is pretty damn serious. People would riot if due process didn't punish you, so you will be punished this time. Fortunately for you, I have just the solution if you want to hear it. Izuku nodded his head vigorously, not trusting his voice not to stutter. Tsukauchi grinned as he flicked through the file on the tablet. Normally, you would be stripped of rank and expelled from UA, but you didn't actually fight any villains. This will grant you a lenient sentence, one where you get to spend it with your girlfriend. Once this is all over, you're going to be spending a week with Himiko as a parole officer while she is receiving therapy. Also, it should be noted that All Might has legally bound her to himself as a guardian. This will entail you keeping her on a lead when she gets to head into public. Izuku smiled happily as he heard the news. This was perfect. Okay, Detective Tsukauchi, I'll accept that. By the way, could I suggest something that could help with Toga's therapy? The detective leaned forward with a lecherous grin. A queen-sized bed and leaving you two alone for the night. Izuku groaned as he felt his face heat up. The hell was up with adults these days? No. I was talking about Tomoko Ragdoll being her therapist for a while. She helped me get through a lot of stuff, and because their personalities are so similar I thought they'd be good together, and… Tsukauchi held up his hand to silence him, his face now serious once more. Really? Well, I'm not quite clued up on the legalities of that, but I have the authority to overrule some regulations. I'll see what I can do. Izuku nodded before the detective motioned to the rookie that escorted him. Himself and Mineta were taken into a police car and driven back to Musatafu, the streetlights providing him with a soft glow to fall asleep to after a hard night's rule breaking. Morning in the Midoriya house. Wake up, my boy, it is time for your duties to begin. Izuku awoke to that line, groggily blinking his eyes as he heard another voice join that one, cooing in his ear. Oh, he looks so cute. Rise and shine, sleepyhead. Opening his eyes fully, he saw All Might standing over his bed and Himiko smiling at him while in his bed. Sitting up and rubbing his eyes, he asked, All Might, Toga, what are you doing here? All Might flashed him a massive smile and a thumbs up. I am simply here to deliver my new charge, young Himiko, to you, my boy. But I would be remiss if, as a mentor and guardian, did not provide ample sums of money for you two to spend together. Take this, capitalism ho. But that the bulky hero strode out of the room, throwing handfuls of money out of his pockets as he went like a bulky American leprechaun. Neither Izuku nor Himiko got up to follow him, sharing a laugh when they heard him say, Thank you for the breakfast, Lady Inko. I was unaware that Cocoa Pops could be prepared in such a way. Who could have imagined cereal in addition to milk could be so delicious? Eventually the house was silent again, Izuku and Toga only staring into each other's eyes as they gauged the other's reaction to whatever they were thinking. Eventually it was Izuku who spoke first. So how are things? She giggled before motioning down to her new non-schoolgirl uniform pajamas, which were covered in various fonts, displaying the words plus ultra. Never better. All Might is really fun to be around, and now I get to spend the week with you outside of that hellhole of a hospital. Things couldn't be better. Izuku smiled, giving her his pillow while getting out of bed. I'm glad to hear it, he sure does work fast, doesn't he? Anyways, I'm going to go and grab a shower, then we can get started with the day. She pouted before digging herself down into the bedsheets, moaning about how she just wanted to laze around. Smiling at her, he grabbed his towel and walked into the bathroom, quickly enjoying the spray of water before cleaning himself up. Once he was finished and back in his room, he saw Himiko had fallen asleep on his bed. Smiling at her, he quickly got into his day clothes before turning around to wake up his guest, before noticing her eyes peeking out through a hole in the covers and a telltale grin on her face. Cute butt. Izuku yelped as he backed away from her and into his chest of drawers, drawing a laugh from her as she got up and out of bed. Alright, see ya in a couple minutes. She skipped out of the room with a bag that he hadn't seen before, covered in chibi versions of the top 10 heroes, to the bathroom. Once the door was locked, he heard a cough and saw his mother standing in the doorframe, holding a camera with a massive grin on her face. And here I was thinking that I would never get grandbabies. Young love. Izuku blinked at her, ignoring the grandbabies part in favor of asking. Wait, you do know what Yoga has done, right? Inko smiled and waved him off. I know she's hurt people, and I know that it might be silly to entrust her not to hurt you, but I talked to All Might when you and Toga were all cuddled up. He talked to me about what you do, why you do it, and what happened last night. I think that Toga will be the best thing to happen to you since your quirk manifested. The silence was palpable, lasting only until Toga walked out of the shower with a languid sigh. Man, I missed a good shower while I was in the slammer. Oh, hey Mrs. M. Inko smiled at her as she said. Oh, don't worry about formalities, Toga. Just call me Inko. Now then, how about Izuku and I go and prepare some breakfast before you two go out shopping? Izuku. She turned to see her son blushing and stuttering, looking anywhere but at Toga. Both girls looked down at her before noticing that the teenager forgot her towel. Toga made a small leap, hiding behind the door as Inko grabbed a towel from the closet and handed it to her. Here you go, honey. Now then, get dressed and come grab some breakfast once you're ready. Grabbing Izuku, the pair left the room, heading into the kitchen to prepare a veritable banquet. Unwilling to talk about the event that just took place, Inko asked Izuku. So, where do you plan on taking her? Izuku looked up from beating together some pancake mix and said. I was thinking about heading to the mall and seeing about getting a new wardrobe sorted for her. All Might did drop at least a couple thousand on his way out. After that, maybe some lunch at a cafe before I guess a movie. Inko smiled and nodded, flipping a piece of French toast. Good boy, I taught you so well. Ah, hi Toga. Izuku turned around from his pancake to look at her, nearly dropping the frying pan when he saw her. Her hair was done up in their usual messy buns, but she was wearing a tank top and shorts that seemed to scream bad girl. Hey Toga. She walked up next to them and laid her chin on Izuku's shoulder, observing the preparations like a hawk. You know, you could probably get All Might to propose if you served him this stuff, Inko. The housewife blushed and covered her cheek with a hand. Oh really? Dropping a kiss on Izuku's cheek, she walked over to the table and dropped into one of the seats, watching as Izuku walked over and laid a large plate of pancakes, meats, and French toast in front of her. Enjoy. She giggled at his nervousness before trying a bite of one of the pancakes and blinking. Izuku watched as her grin slowly began to widen until she ravenously dug into each and every bite on the plate. Dishing up his own, he sat next to her and ate at a slightly more sedate pace, pausing to let Toga rest on his shoulder when her plate was cleared. Noticing that she was eyeing up his own plate hungrily, Izuku chuckled and offered her a slice of bacon, watching as she devoured it in one bite. Inko watched in abject glee as Izuku fed Toga most of his plate, pausing to eat some for himself, but keeping his eyes on her joyful expression every time the fork went her way. Eventually the plates were clean and Inko got up, grabbing the dishes and walking towards the counter. I'll handle this, you two go and get yourself sorted for today. Izuku and Toga nodded to her gratefully before heading off and into the bedroom, gathering up all the money All Might had sprayed over the room and making their way out of the house after saying goodbye to Inko. Izuku turned to Toga, who was busy leaning over the railing and looking down at the street with a quiet smile on her face. You know Izuku? The breath of fresh air is something you have to lose before you can appreciate it. The somber mood was less than optimal for Izuku's plan for the day. Opting for the quiet route, he looped an arm around hers, smiling at her as she looked up in shock. "Well, I guess we're going to have to head into the woods and get some real fresh air. Come on, let's go and get you some clothes." She grinned, showing off her canines briefly before leading them both down the stairwell and into the street, where Izuku pointed to the right with his free hand. "The mall's this way, let's go." The journey into town was like nothing Izuku had before. Usually he went with his mother, both in silence. This time, it was riddled with Toga asking questions about UA, joking quips, and wolf whistles from some of his neighbors. Eventually they reached a large building, and Izuku noticed a pair of young people, maybe around 6 or 7, who were looking around in a panic. They seemed to bear a striking resemblance to a certain green-haired classmate he knew. Nudging Toga in the side, he motioned over to them and with a grin, asked, "Ready for your first bit of hero work?" She nodded, striking a comical All Might-esque pose that Izuku chuckled at. Walking over, he released Toga and knelt down to their eye level. "Hi there. You two wouldn't happen to be lost, would you?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yeah, Big Sis Tsu got dragged away in the crowd and now we can't find her, and..." Izuku chuckled and rubbed his head, ruffling his hair down into his eyes. "Don't worry, Sayu is a friend. I'm Izuku, what's your name?" Both of them seemed to gasp before grinning, their earlier panic completely forgotten. "Izuku, as in Izuku Midoriya. Wow. Big Sis talks about you a lot, you even saved her from villains. That's so cool." Izuku blushed heavily as Toga giggled behind him. Izuku got back up as Toga said, "Well, let's go and find her then." Any idea where she could have gotten off to, Izuku? Izuku scratched his head for a moment before remembering. "Oh, I have her phone number. How about we all go and grab some ice cream and I'll have her meet us at the parlor." Toga cheered along with the two children as they began to bicker over their favorite flavors. Izuku smiled at her, genuinely pleased that she was trying her best not to be vulgar or scary around them. Granted, her cat-like appearance and their frog forms probably formed a kinship between them already. Quickly typing in her contact, he started a call, hearing the dial on the other side quickly thud as the call connected. "Izuku, I'm sorry, but I've lost Satsuki and Samador." Izuku grinned as he followed Toga, who was chaperoning the children as they declared their orders to the ice cream vendor. "Calling you about them, don't worry Tsu. We found them at the entrance of the mall and they're ordering ice cream as we speak. Come to Duncan's Dairy Den at the front of the mall." Sayu sighed in relief as she said, "Thanks a bunch Izuku Kiro. I'll have to repay you for this." "Wait, we..." Izuku hung up and jogged over to where Toga, Satsuki, and Samador were chowing down on Raspberry Ripple, Triple Chocolate Swirl, and the Justice Punch flavor. Sitting down at one of the free chairs, he found a caramel vanilla waiting for him and a mint chocolate waiting in an insulated cup, presumably for Sayu when she got there. "Thanks Toga. Anyways, Sayu's on her way to finish this fast so she doesn't berate me for these heart attacks." Satsuki and Samador grinned at them, their mouths covered in ice cream as they saluted and began to eat faster. Toga chastised them, warning of the horrors of brain freeze as Izuku ate him at a more sedate pace while smiling at her. Despite her constant groaning about the therapy, it seemed like she was genuinely benefiting from it. Eventually they were nearly done when he heard a familiar voice behind him say, "Satsuki, Samador." They all turned to see Sayu panting behind them. Izuku smiled at her and motioned to the spare chair next to him. She nodded, too out of breath to say anything more. The girl dropped down into the offered chair and sighed, looking over her siblings with a critical eye. "Are you two okay? It's a good thing Izuku and..." Sayu turned to Toga and their eyes locked for a moment. An eternity seemed to pass before Sayu's head seemed to grind towards Izuku, her eyes darkened and her voice more menacing than an angry all for one. "Midoriya, would you care to explain Kiro?" He gulped as Toga hid behind him, cautiously looking out from behind him as Satsuki and Samador began to giggle at their sister's reaction. "I can explain, I promise." Swallowing his fear, he pulled Toga out from behind him before saying, "Toga is going through therapy right now. She's going to be joining one after the summer." Sayu huffed before turning up her nose and saying, "Well, if she's being treated then fine. But you're taking me shopping, both of you, as penance. Kiro." Toga and Izuku nodded furiously, not willing to incur her wrath any further. Once Sayu had finished her ice cream, they all stood up and the two older girls took the lead, taking them into one of the nearest female clothing shops. After half an hour of all three girls trying on clothes, Izuku turned to the equally bored and scared Samador. "Don't get involved with girls, don't let this happen to you." The young boy nodded solemnly as he was forced to respond to his sister if an outfit looked nice on her. Izuku wished that was the level that Sayu and Toga kept to, but they just kept getting worse. It was like they were competing for his attention, each swimsuit being more revealing than the last, and each article of clothing giving him images a priest would burn him over. Eventually it reached a climax when both girls walked out of the changing room, each in what appeared to be French-made uniforms. It was too much for the hero in training, who cried out as he covered his eyes. Why the hell does a place like this even keep stuff like that? The one saving grace of the situation was that they both seemed to have reconciled their past, obviously having a heart-to-heart in the changing room as they devised their latest visual torture. Once they had finished, Toga and Sayu grabbing a couple outfits each and some assorted articles of clothing and Satsuki settling on a summer hat, they went up to the register where Izuku brought out a couple thousand yen and handed it over to the sympathetic cashier. Once they were outside, Izuku was weighed down with 3 bags which he took in stride. Sayu checked her phone and sighed. Well, it looks like we're going to have to get going. You wanna meet up again sometime, Toga? I know this great cafe and I can even bring your Raka, that brunette from Camp Kiro. Toga grinned and nodded, forgetting Izuku was even there. Sure. It'll be good to settle things before school starts. Sayu nodded and took her bag from Izuku, dropping a kiss on his cheek. Cool. I'll see you around, Izuku, thanks for finding Satsuki and Samador. He nodded, not willing to look at Toga's reaction to the kiss as the trio walked off and into the crowd. Anxiously turning his head to Toga, he saw her mischievous smile. Oh, this is going to be fun. I wonder if she's up for a threesome sometime. As best he could, he hushed her, his head turning to make sure nobody heard her. Please don't say stuff like that in public. She shrugged and nodded, wrapping her arm around his. So, head anywhere in particular? Izuku glanced over at the music shop and nodded. Sure, do you mind if I go and grab some supplies over at Big Jam? Toga curiously looked over at the store before nodding with a smile. Sure. He nodded gratefully and led them into the store, hearing the bell signal their arrival. The cashier was busy under the desk and Izuku only got a muffled sup from behind it. Shrugging, he went over to the guitar section and looked over some of the new straps that had come in. Toga was busy looking over some of the other stuff in the record section. Eventually he heard a sigh of relief and looked up to see a familiar face behind the counter. Jiru. The girl in question turned to see him and smiled, throwing a wave in his direction. Hey Midoriya, is life good? Izuku nodded and noticed Toga looking at her curiously. Oh, you should probably meet Toga before school starts. Toga, Jiru. Jiru, Toga. Toga will be joining Class A next term. The goth girl sized up the former villain with a smirk. Oh. Well, that's pretty cool. Side note, fucking hell Midoriya, what was last night? Did you actually head there to go and rescue a bunch of heroes? Toga smirked at him from across the store and Izuku nodded, garnering a smile from Jiru. That was a pretty kick-ass man. By the way, if you're down you can join us for the study session in a couple days, Toga. The blonde's eyes widened for a moment before smiling at her. Sounds good. I'll be there. Izuku finally decided on a green lightning covered strap for his acoustic and went up to pay, Jiru still chatting with Toga. She rang him up before leaning forward on her forearms. Nice catch. See you at Momo's, Izuku. He nodded, a shred of embarrassment making its way onto his face at the compliment. As they both walked out of the store and back into the mall, he felt Toga tug on his arm, pointing in the direction of a cutesy-made cafe. Come on, Izuku. If I catch you looking at any of them, I choose next. Izuku sighed and nodded, resigning the day into his category of why Aizawa hates us. The rest of the day was somewhat similar, letting Toga experience the life of a free girl while he facilitated her joy. Honestly, he knew he was going to enjoy spending the week with Toga, but it was much better than he had envisioned. Her little smiles whenever somebody greeted her, not in fear, but with their own little smiles, was heartwarming for Izuku. At the end of the day, both were sitting in the movie theater watching Romeo and Juliet 3. No Man's Land. Laughing at the silly comedy that seemed to tickle Toga particularly. Eventually they had reached a lull in the top-notch comedy, now watching as the movie turned into a particularly dark scene as Nomo had his tear ducts cauterized shut by the Red Rebels. Toga leaned into his shoulder, smiling as they watched Juliet receive the same treatment. All in all, a pretty good day in Izuku's books. What he wasn't aware of was All Might in a trench coat and fedora hiding behind a newspaper a few rows back, glancing over at them. They seemed to be enjoying themselves. Perhaps the addition of yet more money into the situation will heighten their enjoyment. Izuku walked arm in arm with Toga, following directions from Jiru on how to get to Yaoi Rozu's house. It had been a couple of days since they had gone to the mall, and Izuku had been performing his duties as a parole officer admirably, drawing praise from All Might, who took to visiting Inko. It was in this time that Izuku had heard some unsavory news, the results from the fight with All for One. His cover was still intact after the fight, but there was no way he was going to survive another fight anywhere close to that one. Following this, he decided along with Nezu and Recovery Girl to forge a story that seemed viable enough. Izuku inwardly sighed as he remembered the story of how his quirk was but a vehicle to destroy that villain. The villain has been defeated, thus his quirk has died, and, as such, he would allow a new generation to step up into the spotlight. Subtly looking down at Toga, Izuku noticed that she seemed to be incredibly excited for this study session, not surprising considering what he had learned. According to her therapist who he had been to see along with Toga, she was experiencing a form of obsession with a vision which happened to be the normal schoolgirl look. It leads to her being obsessed with having a boyfriend, going to class, being popular, and having friends, which is why her conduct seems so insane. Izuku had made sure to get All Might to allow her a cell phone and gave her the contact info for Tsuyu and Ichako, which seemed to make her eyes light up and a grin stretched across her face. Eventually the two turned a corner, the last in their set of directions, and balked at the sheer size of the house. Shaking his head and looking to Toga, he shrugged, drawing a quiet giggle from her as she went on ahead to hit the buzzer. Both of them heard a small voice come from the device. Midoriya and Himiko, right? I'll send Matt, welcome. The gate slid open and they walked up to the house, knocking with a creak. The door opened with a barely noticeable creak and they were greeted by two people. One was the butler that helped Izuku carry the drinks back to the poolside, while the other was Momo's father. Momo's dad was a small man, contrasting Momo's tall figure with a mop of brown hair and a roguish grin on his face. Midoriya, good to see you. I don't believe we've been introduced yet, little lady James Yaoi Rozu. Himiko giggled and nodded. I'm Toga Himiko, thanks for having us sir. James chuckled and motioned for the butler, who Izuku assumed to be Matt, forward. Well, if you wouldn't mind, Matt can bring you up and get you settled in. Midoriya, do you mind if I have a word? Izuku nodded while Toga enthusiastically skipped over to the old butler. Watching them go off and up the stairs, Izuku turned back to see James holding a bottle of brown liquid, a vintage cupboard next to them hanging open. In response to Izuku's questioning eyes, James just grinned and produced two tumblers. You're a better man than I, Midoriya. I couldn't handle two of the girls up there, let alone the entirety. Anyways, I wanted to talk to you about Momo. Izuku's eyebrow went up as he took the proffered tumblers carefully. What about her, sir? Also, call me Izuku. James nodded and leaned against the wall, sipping his drink while rubbing his head. Sure, call me James though. Anyways, it seems the sports festival really did a number on her confidence. She used to be so strong and independent, giving the orders and making them count. After that kid, Tokoyami, if I remember, beat her so easily, I think she's been having issues with it. She was making improvements after passing her exam, but ever since a couple days before going off to training camp, she's slowly been regressing. What I'm asking for is the opinion of one of her classmates, cause I sure as shit ain't getting a straight answer out of her. Izuku took a tentative sip of the whiskey, coughing lightly as his cheeks reddened. Well, I haven't really seen it before, but I know she's been having a little trouble. I think she could do with being put in a leadership role more often, get her used to it, you know. I think this study group will be a good way to get her on the path to being confident again, but it needs to be kept up. James just leaned and listened before muttering. I kinda see where you're coming from. Any ideas on how to keep it up? I'm embarrassed to say, but work's been taking so much of my attention recently, I can't spend as much time with Momo as I'd like. Izuku downed the rest of his drink, feeling the warmth radiate through him like One for All, as he said. Maybe something like sport would be a good idea, or even just asking for her opinion more often. If that doesn't work, try clearing an entire beach of trash and flex in front of a mirror, that did the trick for me. James followed suit, downing his tumbler. Oh, that was you? Anyways, thanks for the insight, Izuku. We should go do laser tag sometimes, you do laser tag. Izuku laughed before shaking his head, meeting a fist from James with his own. Walking up the stairs, doing his best to keep his head straight, he heard the girls in one of the rooms and knocked on the door. Hi. The room fell silent until he heard Momo announce. Come to Izuku. Turning the door handle, Izuku walked into the room and gulped, now very thankful for the alcohol in his system. All of the girls were sprawled out on a tennis court-sized bed with their bags and books in front of them. Looking around, he saw Toga belly down with her legs swinging through the air next to Tsuyu and Ichako, who gave waves to Izuku when they saw him. Momo got up and got off the bed and walked over to him, grabbing his hand. Welcome. Come on, make yourself comfortable and we can start. Izuku allowed himself to be pulled by Momo over to where she, Jiru, Hagakure, and Mina were all sprawled out in various positions a lesser man would have fainted at. Sitting down at the far edge of the group, he leaned up against the wall and sighed, letting the feather-soft pillows swallow him. Mina grinned at him before crawling over, making use of his moment of rest to get in close and lean her head up against his shoulder. Hey Midori, these pillows are great, aren't they? He nodded, subconsciously leaning his own head on her own while not quite catching the innuendo. Mina seemed conflicted over the results of her subtle teasing, but nonetheless enjoyed the jealous looks from Tsuyu and Uraraka and winking back at the blushing Toga. Izuku felt another presence at his side get close and turned to see Momo get comfortable as well. At his questioning glance she blushed and tried to explain herself. I find it easier to understand notes if I can read them, you don't mind do you? Shaking his head they all got to work, Mina slowly becoming more disillusioned until she resorted to lying on Izuku's lap and listening to them speak like a podcast while he ran his hand through her hair and using his other to hold open his book so Momo could read his notes. Toga had taken a couple of sneaky photos of the three, giggling along with Uraraka and Tsuyu. After a couple of hours Momo clapped her hands together and said, "Well, I guess it's time for lunch. Shall we all eat here or do we want to eat in the hall?" There was a general consensus for them to eat in the hall, not willing to fill the bed with crumbs. They all got up and made their way with Momo at the front of the pack and Izuku bringing up the rear, watching all of the girls mingle with a smile. As they stood outside of the hall Momo stopped, apparently shocked by something inside. Mina tapped her shoulder and asked, "Everything okay yeah Momo?" The upper class girl nodded before asking someone who was on the inside. What are you doing here Miss Ragdoll?" Izuku took a pause at that as everyone began to funnel into the room and Izuku saw the woman herself sitting at the head of the table in a flowing green dress. Upon seeing him she waved at him and exclaimed, "Izu. Come sit with me." All of the girls' eyes went wide as Izuku obeyed, walking around the girls and sitting down next to Ragdoll. Her wounds had healed pretty well, leaving an eye patch across her left eye. "Ragdoll, how have you been? Are you recovering well?" She nodded happily as she stretched her arm across her chest. "Yep. I heard you were there to get me out of the fight you crazy kitten, pretty cool. Anyways, you'll be seeing a lot more of me in the future, actually most of you will. If you could all get sat down, I'll begin telling you why I'm here." Everybody took their place, Momo instantly making her way to the seat next to Izuku in virtue of her being the closest. Once they were all sat down Ragdoll stood up and cleared her throat theatrically. "Well, hi everyone. My name's Ragdoll and I'll be starting at UA as a counselor. Normally, you would be sent to Hound Dog, but he's been busy recently, so I'll be taking over yourselves and Class 1B anyways, since I've been sent here in an official capacity. I need to talk to you about the new dorm system that UA is preparing to implement." Instantly there was a burst of murmurs as they all began to excitedly talk about the possibility of living together. Ragdoll waited for the noise to calm down before continuing. "It may be exciting, but please be aware, this is a measure not taken lightly. We have reason to suspect that with All Might's retirement, along with the League of Villains leaving a power vacuum in the criminal world, that foreign powers are planning on filling in. We plan on doing this as a preemptive measure against the powers that be in addition to letting you all mingle in an effort to increase cooperation. We'll be sending out messages to parents and guardians, along with making individual visits to everyone tomorrow, so you can discuss it beforehand." At that point two butlers appeared, pushing carts into the room stacked with sandwiches, cakes, and tea. As they served everyone, Ragdoll stood up and jerked her thumb in the direction of the door. "Well, I'd better get going. If you guys want to talk, just come to my office in the UA." Izuku stood up, saying, "I'll walk you to the door." She grinned and nodded enthusiastically. Leaning on him she was the target of many envious glares from 1A as they left the room and down the corridor to the front door. Izuku cleared his mind as best he could before asking quietly, "How are you doing? I know what happened." Ragdoll sighed, a lock of teal hair making its way into his vision as she mumbled, "It's been hard, weird as well. Recovery girl is making me wear this eye patch on one eye at a time, recalibrating them before I can take it off. More importantly though." Izuku could feel her grin into his hair, drawing a grin on his own face. "Yes." She wrapped her arms around his shoulders while saying conspiratorially, "Don't play coy with me mister. Seriously, every single one of your female classmates, a former villain, and even Pixie Bob. I should probably ask, as your new counselor, have you had the talk?" Izuku shrugged, knowing that it was pointless trying to hide anything from her seeing, as she seemed to be as sharp as a tack as usual. "K kinda. I know how everything works, but mom never really told me about much and I never needed to know." Ragdoll hummed in displeasure. "That won't do, especially considering the company you're keeping and your age. Tell you what, drop by my office when you're settled in the dorms and we'll have that sleepover. I'll invite Pixie Bob over, it'll be funny." Izuku grinned up at her as she disconnected at the front door. "Sounds good. I'll see you around Rag." She smiled and grabbed him into a hug. it's Tomoko to my little savior. Anyways, see you tomorrow Izu. He waved to her as she went down and got into her Hummer, a stark contrast from her personality, but endearing all the same. When he got back to the hall there were panicked voices, causing him to burst into the room in search of the danger. What he saw was something he hadn't seen in a while, but familiar all the same. Toga was playing with her knife in her chair, grinning psychotically at the rest and seemingly choosing her victim as the girls huddled away from her over the table. Realizing the problem, Izuku pushed past the girls gently, some worriedly trying to hold him back. Arriving in front of her, Izuku knelt down and began to whisper. Toga, do you need blood? Her head flicked up and golden orbs locked with his own for a moment, and a glimpse of fear was obviously present before it was overcome with bloodlust again. Lunging forward, Izuku managed to grab her wrist, holding the knife far away from her. She began to thrash, so he quickly activated full cowl and took the knife from her, throwing it across the room. Now that it was out of the way, Izuku wrapped his arm around her stomach and lifted his other to her mouth, giving her an opportunity to bite. She opened wide and clamped down, drawing a quick pained gasp from him, along with horrified gasps from the girls who were whispering to each other about what was happening. Once Toga had settled into her meal, Izuku looked up to Momo and said, "Sorry about this, I should have fed her before we left." She shakily shook her head, indicating that it was no problem. Izuku nodded in turn, turning his attention back to Toga and using his newly available hand to stroke her hair. The girls all returned to their seats, watching in a mix of horror, disgust and envy as Izuku fed Toga. After a couple minutes she seemed to gasp and instantly release her grip. Panicked, she looked around and began to despair at the looks from her classmates. She tried to jump up to escape, but Izuku wouldn't relinquish his hold, causing her to begin to sob. Panically, Izuku pulled her into his shirt, letting her cry into it. Looking up at the girl's confused look, he decided to explain what had happened. Toga suffers from quirk insanity, so she needs blood to stay sane. She's going through therapy, but… Momo perked up at the mention of the disorder. I remember reading about that. My cousin used to suffer from it. He needed to constantly be using his fat reserves, or else he would begin to eat them himself. If I remember right, its symptoms can be anything from a minor tic to full-blown sociopathy. The explanation from their pseudo-leader seemed to appease some of the girls. Achako plucked up her courage before reaching out an arm and laying it on Toga's shaking shoulder. Don't worry Toga, we're not going to throw you away just cause you're suffering. You know, maybe Deku could teach us how to feed you in case he's not around or needs a break. Toga looked up from Izuku's shirt, her eyes red and puffy as she looked questioningly at her. The reassuring look was enough to cause her to smile again as Izuku said to all of them. If any of you want to learn how to help Toga, it could be really useful. I'd be happy to tell you what I've learned if you're interested. There was still some residual tension in the room. Anybody would feel nervous after nearly being stabbed open by a new troubled classmate. Ever socially adept, Mina spoke out. Well, I'd love to learn how to help, but I doubt mine would be that palatable. Everyone laughed and the tone was once again lighthearted. Toga finished drinking up the blood she needed and gave Izuku a quick kiss on the cheek, staining him with what could be mistaken for lipstick. Mina and Turu Wolf whistled them, drawing a laugh from the rest of the girls. Sitting down next to Momo again, the girl in question quickly created a handkerchief and a band-aid. Izuku was about to say he was fine before Momo caringly wiped the blood from his cheek and put the plaster over the puncture wounds on his wrist. Before he could get a word in, she quickly poured him some tea and dropped a sugar cube into it, stirring it meticulously before placing it in front of him. You really should keep your blood sugar up, you can't be draining yourself like that without proper care. Izuku noticed how much she acted like an older sister and nodded. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks Momo. She blushed and looked away before saying. No problem, but you had better keep it up by helping Mina with her ethics after lunch. By the way, I think it's really admirable that you can help Toga like you did, none of us had any idea what to do. Izuku blushed, muttering thanks before sipping his tea. After a couple of sandwiches and cakes, they all made their way back upstairs and back onto the bed. Once they were all settled down, Izuku crawled over to Mina and said. Momo said you were having some trouble with ethics, anything I can help with? She frustratedly threw her hands up above her head before letting them fall down across her eyes. Apparently. The thing is, ever since I saw Midnight's first costume I realized that the best combat potential I'm going to get is by going near enough nude. Seriously, if I'm going to be taking down villains I need every help I can get, right? Izuku made a smile before grabbing out his hero analysis book from his backpack and motioning for Mina to sit next to him. She did so and watched as he flipped to a page on Mount Lady. I think I understand where you're coming from, so I'll do my best to explain what's going on. You see, weaponized sexuality can actually be an effective tool against some villains. Many of them are street punks and people that are resentful of not having a normal life, so they usually have never had a girlfriend or partner. Heroes like Mount Lady or Midnight, or any good-looking hero in general, are able to use their physical appeal to distract or charm an opponent. So from a combat perspective, having a sexual appeal can be a good idea. The thing is, an outfit can often be more appealing than full nudity, as it causes imagination to activate and distract the villain. Not to mention, brands and publicity will be much easier to obtain if you're not exposing children to stuff like that or controversy. Mina nodded into his shoulder, and Izuku was pleasantly surprised to see that she had actually stayed awake during the whole speech. I see, so I need to see about fixing up my costume and making it more appealing. Do you have any ideas? Izuku hummed, taking the matter more seriously than he should. Maybe some kind of form-fitting armor, maybe stylized like chitin while emphasizing your assets. It would fit in with your original idea of alien queen, but it would allow you to show skin along with being a recognizable and distinctive look. I could also pull it off if I revealed more muscle, considering that's a generally appealing character trait. He paused for a moment, realizing that he had just conceptualized armor that could be in a certain kind of film for a certain kind of demographic, while he subconsciously flexed his own ego. Looking at Mina's reaction, she seemed to be just as shocked as he was at his spiel, before grinning coyly. Who knew you had it in ya? Mineta has way too much influence over you. Both of them shared a laugh for a moment, drawing slight attention from some of the groups that had split off to study individual topics. They discussed ideas and issues that might arise from some of them before Toru curled over, announced by the dent in the mattress and the floating flower she had put in her hair. Hey Izuku. I was wondering if you could help Ichako and I with ethics for a bit. Izuku nodded, not noticing Mina glaring at the invisible girl for interrupting them. Grabbing his books, Izuku bade farewell to Mina and followed Toru over to where herself and Ichako had their books laid out. Ichako smiled and waved at them as they approached, saying, as her green-haired friend sat down. Hey Deku, thanks for helping us out. He nodded and smiled back brilliantly. No problem, you're Raka-san. Now, where do you want to start? It turned out that both of them were rather attentive in ethics class, just lacking in a few key areas like property damage and sacrifice. The lessons continued for about 2 hours until Momo called out for them to break. That'll be enough for everyone today. Anyways, let's talk about the dorm system. Everyone called out in agreement and put away their books before gathering around in a circle. Izuku broke off from them, leaning up against the wall so as to not intrude. A lot of speculation was thrown around, wondering what the dorms would be like and what could be happening with Ragdoll as their counselor. Eventually Izuku got slightly bored and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his hero news app he had found a while back. Of course, there was the All Might vs All for One fight still in the papers, but a specific headline caught his eye. British Hero Agency Institute to establish a Japanese branch. Swiping it open, Izuku scanned the article, his curiosity growing with every line. In a recent statement from the leader of Institute Arcturus Waters, he claimed that the institute will be opening a Japanese branch in the capital of Tokyo. In the statement, he claimed that the reason for this expansion was to inspire the generally talented young heroes of Japan to consider their agency, bringing new talent and life to the institute. One of the heroes of the agency, police hero Caitlin, said this. Japan is a country with many powerful heroes. I believe that this expansion will allow us to introduce some new blood into our mix, perhaps allowing us to funnel some of that talent back into our own country. As some may know, our agency is primarily concerned with terrorism and wide-scale attacks. If we are to bring in some foreign and unknown quirks, it could give us an unprecedented advantage over some of our more elusive enemies. Many have claimed that the institute is a lawless agency, punishing their heroes lightly for breaches of the law and having few guidelines. The general comparison made is between Institute and UA High School in their conduct. In response to the allegations, Arcturus Waters had this to say. While I admit our punishment system is less strict than other systems, we are dedicated to upholding the law, and I resent allegations that we don't. We firmly believe that the lives of civilians and our agents are more valuable than any cost to property. As for the comparisons to UA High School, I find that to be a high compliment. While we have not made contact with Principal Nezu on the matter of our recruitment-based expansion, we are firmly open to any form of cooperation between our establishments. For more information on the institute and their achievements, check out this article. For UA and the quality of their heroes, see this article. Arcturus Waters and the dark tale behind his rise to glory, see below. Izuku pondered this development carefully as he tuned out the chatter in the background. A British agency, one focusing on recruitment no less. He never really thought about going to an agency after his graduation, but this could be a good way to get his name as the symbol of peace out to the world. He heard a small cough and a poke to his arm and looked up to see all the girls looking at him with indiscernible eyes. Jiro spoke up, being the one who poked him in the first place. Izuku, we were wondering if it would be possible for Toga to stay with us for a girl-only sleepover. You think it would be possible? Izuku pondered it for a moment before responding. I'll ask All Might if it's okay, and if it is, I'll fill Toga up and head home. I'll need to be here to walk her home in the morning, so send me a text and I'll come over to pick her up. All of the girls cheered, sans Jiro, who just grinned. Dialing his mentor's number, Izuku waited for a moment before he heard the voice of All Might boom from the other side. Ah, how can I help you, young Midoriya? Izuku held the phone away from his ear for a moment, checking to make sure that speaker mode was off. Hey All Might. I was wondering if it was okay for Toga to stay with the girls in Class A for a sleepover. Would it be okay legally? A hum that could be mistaken for a helicopter echoed throughout the room. I see no issue with the arrangement. However, you are to stress to her the importance of brushing one's teeth. Dental hygiene has been the downfall of many villains and heroes alike. Why, have I told you of the time when a werewolf villain broke his teeth against my thyroid? Izuku cut him off before he gave an endless speech. Okay, I'll relay it back and make sure she has a toothbrush. All Might said his goodbye before disconnecting the line. Izuku turned back to the girls and announced. It's no problem. Toga, let's get you fed quickly and I'll need to talk to Momo about arrangements. His blonde charge cheered happily and charged him, bringing both of them down into the pillows with her on top of him. Yay. Okay, get that wrist up here, mister. He quickly fed her, stroking her hair like usual as he spoke to Momo, who was vehemently trying to ignore the act. She'll need pajamas and a toothbrush, especially a toothbrush. Don't feed her sugar after 9 o'clock and don't forget to give her a hug before she goes to sleep, night terrors. If she needs to get some fresh air, open the window and close the curtain so she doesn't feel the need to escape through it. Finally, do not, under threat of not sleeping, allow her to tell you ghost stories. Momo nodded, noting down everything on a pen and paper while awing at the need for a hug that Toga clenched down on his wrist hard for. Once he was finished, he allowed Momo to patch up his wrist and offered him a soda from a mini fridge in the wall, keeping his blood sugar up. Getting up from the bed and grabbing his bag, he went to the door with Momo. Turning around, he said to the girls who were all watching them leave. See you tomorrow, everyone. Toga, you are good now. They all called out similar goodbyes as Toga nodded vehemently. Walking down to the door with Momo, he was greeted by James again, who waved to him with a grin and a bottle of whiskey he recognized as the one they had drunk out of before. Hey Izuku, thanks for helping out with Momo and her friends today. A little present from myself in hopes you'll come around again sometime. It's nice to have some male company for once. Izuku nodded gratefully as Momo watched in horror as Izuku took the bottle. Daddy. Izuku's underage, this could really affect his career. James held a finger up to his lips while grinning. Yeah, but it's good shit, so he'd be an idiot to refuse it. Anyways, I'll send transport tomorrow morning whenever Himiko is ready to be collected, so don't worry about it. See you around, Izuku. As he walked away into the depths of the house, Momo turned to Izuku and sighed. Well, I guess I can't argue with that. Please be careful on the way home, it's getting quite late. Izuku nodded and was about to leave when he felt a hand on his shoulder stop him. Turning around, he was met with a pair of lips on his own, along with Momo's closed eyes. As soon as it started, she broke it off and smiled at him with a blush. Thanks for coming to Izuku, I really mean it. He couldn't do much more than nod before he walked out, holding his free hand up to his lips in shock. Once he was about halfway down the street, he realized that he still had the bottle of whiskey in his hand and began to panically stow it in his bag. He sighed as he checked the time, 5:30. Considering the time, he didn't have much to head to the pool or the arcade, not to mention he didn't have much free time since Toga had begun her stint with them. Shrugging, he decided to head home and relax, figuring that it would be somewhat of a commodity soon since the dorm system would be implemented. Arriving back home at around 6:15, he called out a greeting to his mother, who was surprised by the absence of Toga. Izuku, where's Toga? Isn't she supposed to be with you at all times? He shrugged and replied as he took off his shoes. All Might gave her the clear to stay with the girls, so I guess it's okay. She nodded and went back to her program as Izuku walked into his room, sighing at the state of the room. Putting away a couple bits of his clothing, staying away from Toga's piles, he eventually reached his PC. He proceeded to spend the next couple hours looking over the details of the institute, making notes on some of the exotic quirks he had noticed among the ranks. One he was quite interested in was the police hero Caitlin, who apparently had an aiming quirk along the lines of snipe. Inko eventually came into the room with his dinner and placed it in front of him with a smile. There you go, Izuku, it was getting cold. Looking at the time, he gasped. Quickly apologizing to his mother, he ate the lukewarm fish as he continued to make notes. Ragdoll had claimed that foreign powers would be becoming more prevalent in the future, so it was best to research them before they arrived. Once the clock struck 11 p.m., he decided to call it quits and head to bed. Grabbing his phone from the desk, he took off his shirt and collapsed into the warm embrace and began to envy Toga for getting to sleep in the lavish confines of Momo's bed. He was on the verge of sleep when he heard his phone vibrate. With a groan, he picked it up and hit the accept call button. Holding it to his ear, he heard the voice of Toga in amongst the giggles of the rest of the girls. "Good night, Izuku." Amidst the annoyance, he felt a small twinge of happiness that she had taken the time out of her fun to wish him good night. "Night, Toga," to the rest of the girls as well. She giggled and relayed the message to the rest of them, and he could hear them call out their own variants of goodnight to him. Toga said goodnight once more before closing off the call, leaving Izuku alone once again. It was then when he realized just how oppressive the silence was in the room without her snores in the bed adjacent to his. Despite this, he somehow managed to fall asleep into a light slumber. Time skip, morning. Izuku awoke groggily, rubbing his hand over his eyes. Blinking away the sleep, he looked around the room and remembered that Toga had spent the night with Momo and the rest of the girls. Looking over at his phone, he saw that a single message was waiting for him. Grabbing it and swiping it open, he smiled contentedly at Momo's picture of Toga, Uraraka, and Tsuyu all huddled together while sleeping. Checking the timing, he saw that it was taken at 6 a.m. Well, it was about 7 a.m. now. Figuring they were awake by now, he texted back. "Thanks, nice to know she managed it. Did everything go smoothly?" He began to get ready to shower, hearing a reply about 20 seconds later. "It was great. Everyone was amazing, and Toga was completely okay. You do realize you sound like a protective older brother, right?" Blushing heavily at the accusation, he quickly pinned back. "Can you blame me? Anyways, thanks for being so helpful for her first sleepover. When do you want me to come and pick her up?" She penned back a reply quite quickly, attaching a picture of Toga still asleep with Ichako and Tsuyu. "Probably in a while, those three are really comfortable together. Father will send a limo when they're ready, I'll warn you beforehand though." Izuku smiled again and penned back a quick KK before heading into the shower, enjoying the feeling of having a long shower. Once he got back into his room, he got dressed and decided to finish cleaning up his room. Grabbing a quick bowl of cereal, considering his mother was still asleep, he got stuck into making the entire room feel new again. After finding some action figures under beds and Toga's underwear strewn around in places he didn't want to think about, he finally called it a job at about 10 a.m. Looking at his phone, he realized that Momo hadn't texted him back yet, which caused him some concern, but wrote it off as they were messing around and she couldn't get the chance. Greeting his mother, he lazed around in his room for a while, looking over his hero notebooks while listening to some music. Eventually he heard the doorbell ring and got up to answer it, knowing he was closer to the door than the living room. Opening it up, he peered out to see Ragdoll standing there in a coat and miniskirt. "Hey Izuku. Do you mind if I come in?" Izuku grinned and stepped out of the way, bowing with a flourish. "Of course, mladdie." She giggled and cuffed him over the head, drawing a yelp from him, along with a mock-hurt expression. Ragdoll just smiled at him and turned to Inko, who was standing and watching the proceedings with confusion. "Hey Mrs. Midoriya. I'm Ragdoll and Class 1A's new counselor. If you don't mind, I would like to speak to the two of you about a piece of news you received last night." Inko blushed before admitting that. "Well, I didn't quite read it." Ragdoll just laughed her concerns off. "No matter, I'll just catch you up then. Shall we get seated?" Inko hurriedly nodded and rushed off to prepare some tea as Izuku led her to the living room. She whistled at the cleanliness of the entire house, commenting, "Damn, nice place, Izuku. How do you keep it so clean?" He chuckled, rubbing the back of his head in embarrassment. "Well, it's always just been myself and Mom, so we never needed to do much cleaning. Not to mention Dad sends us money back from overseas, so Mom can stay home." Ragdoll nodded, crossing her legs, as Inko placed a teapot and a cup in front of each of them. Once they were all settled, Ragdoll cleared her throat and began. "Well, Mrs. Midoriya, I've been sent here to talk to you about UA's new dormitory system. Quite simply, the danger associated with the League of Villains was not the only one present. The UA is concerned that we're going to be hit by something or someone else, so we intend to set as much in our favor as we can before they arrive. This program will include more teaching hours, accessible counseling, and the opportunity for the class to mingle and grow up in a semi-independent setting. Thanks to a recent surge in government funding, thanks to All Might's final fight, not to mention some recent developments with a hero agency, we are able to fund this entire operation independently." Inko hummed as she looked down into her cup of tea as Izuku watched her carefully. He knew she was a bit of a mother hen and was constantly worried about him, but surely she would allow him to grow alongside his friends, right? "Ms. Ragdoll, excuse me for asking, but what is my son to you?" Both of their eyes widened, that question being the furthest from their expectations. Izuku and Ragdoll began to laugh simultaneously, causing Inko to shuffle uncomfortably until Ragdoll explained. Well, before I was a counselor I helped train Izuku at the training camp UA put on, so we knew each other before this all happened. I psychoanalyzed him, we talked, he listened, and we just clicked like a kitten to cream. Don't worry Mrs. Midoriya, I'll conduct myself professionally with Izuku when required. Izuku grinned as Inko sighed in relief. Thank goodness, I was worried something more immoral was going on. Both of their eyes locked before they burst out laughing again. Izuku turned to his mom and wheezed out. Mom, don't be silly. Tomoko is a great friend, but she's way too old for me. The woman in question took mock offense to this as she leaned over the table and swatted him over the head. Shut it you. Anyways, now that that's out of the way, what's the verdict? Inko smiled at the interaction before nodding succinctly. Well, I doubt I'd be able to argue after seeing that display. Please take care of my son Ms. Ragdoll, he's very important to me. Ragdoll saluted playfully as she said. You can count on me Mrs. Midoriya. We're opening the dorms in 2 days, but you can come in at any time to get them decorated and set up. A small chime sounded out from her wrist and Ragdoll looked down at her watch, grimacing at the time. Looking back up at the pair she said. Well, if that's your answer I had better get going. I'll see myself out. They all got up and Inko thanked her for her time while Izuku met her fist with his, grinning at each other brightly. Once they heard the door close behind the teacher Izuku smiled at his mother, who promptly embraced him in a hug. Please enjoy yourself Izuku. It's been hard since you've joined the UA, but you've been so much happier ever since you've made friends. Just ride home sometimes, okay? Izuku nodded into her shoulder, completely enveloped in the somber tone of the moment. Once they broke off Inko pushed him towards his room lightly. Now then, you go and begin to figure out what you want to take with you while I get lunch started. Also, I thought you were supposed to go and get Toga from the Yaoi Oasis. He nodded, motioning back to his room. Yeah, Momo was going to text me when I was supposed to come over. She said she would send a car. They were cut off by a loud car horn blaring just outside of their house. Izuku ran off outside to see what the commotion was and sweat dropped at the godforsaken sight that greeted him. Hello young Midoriya, it has come to my attention that you do not own an automobile. As such, considering it is your birthday probably, let me introduce you to the Deku Mobile. Lo and behold, All Might standing on top of a dark green recreation of the Batmobile of a bygone age where heroes made some iota of sense. He also spied James Yaoi Rozu struggling to breath as he looked at All Might in the rearview mirror. The man instead held up a megaphone and said up to him. Sup kid. I know we only met yesterday, but All Might decided that I should come along as well, so here I am. Izuku looked around and saw that most everyone in his building had come out to see the commotion and were beginning to make connections, leaving the young hero mortified. He also spied Ragdoll laughing her ass off in front of her Hummer. Sighing to himself he flashed a smile at his mother before running off down the stairs, grinning despite himself. Wait, my birthday was like 4 weeks ago. Did All Might forget or something? As he made his way over to where the hero was standing, he couldn't begin to understand the mental complexities of the former #1 hero. Yet. More. Money. Izuku smiled as he looked out at the rest of his classmates, the majority of them being completely out of breath as he calmly sipped a glass of water. It was unanimously agreed that they would try and come in all at the same time to get set up just to socialize in the lead up to the beginning of the new school term. All of them were pretty pumped about being allowed to live together, Bakugo begrudgingly, saying that it would be easier to get to class this way. Many of them had questioned the fate of Mineta, and Izuku gave them the best explanation he could that he was dropping out of the hero course. Needless to say, manators were shed. He saw Todoroki and Iida come downstairs together, both breathing heavily as they came over to him and leaned up against the countertop with him. Hey guys, all done? Todoroki nodded as Iida poured the two of them their own glasses. Yeah, everything's in place. It was kind of Momo to upgrade all of our furniture though. Izuku nodded, peering over at Momo who was being fed like Henry VIII as she created all manner of furniture and bedding. When he questioned her about it, she claimed that the girls had asked her to do it after spending a night with her in her massive bed at Yaoi Rozu Manor and she saw no problem with it. Izuku, being ever helpful, offered to help her move in when she was done making furniture which she took gratefully. Eventually they were all done and were sitting around in their new living room, exchanging stories from their summer. Toga had taken to the rest of the boys in the class just as well, some of them being weirder than others considering her past. After a couple more minutes they heard a knock at the door and Izuku went over to answer. He saw Aizawa was standing there in his usual hero attire, his eyes disproportionately more tired than usual, most likely due to getting everything ready. Midoriya, is everyone here? He nodded, spying the Deku mobile parked outside the dorm. At first many of them had protested him being allowed to have a car, but All Might had been very adamant about allowing him to keep it as a sign of a boy becoming a man. Izuku had questioned about being allowed to drive without a license, but apparently money had a bigger reach than he could imagine. Nevertheless, he would prefer to learn how to drive before he attempted it, causing All Might to proclaim that he would seek a teacher. Izawa stepped past him, causing everybody to wave to their teacher, who cleared his throat before announcing, "Okay, if you're all here, let's get this straight. You're all going to be out of here before 6 p.m, no sleeping here tonight. The entire rule list will be posted on the notice board, be sure to read it before you leave." Their teacher left, leaving them all alone. There was a minute of conversation before Momo was finished making the last nightstand for Tokoyami, causing Izuku to walk over and say, "Hey Momo, you want to get started on your room then?" She grinned up at him and offered him her hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. She pointed to a pile of boxes by the stairs and grinned sheepishly. "Sure. Do you mind helping carry those upstairs?" Izuku nodded and dutifully went over to the pile, loading up all 4 boxes under his arm and heading up as Momo subtly checked out his muscles from behind. They arrived at a room and Izuku marveled at how clean it was. UA really did have too much time on their hands. Once he dropped the boxes at the front, he turned back to Momo before gasping and turning around, realizing she had taken off her clothes to create her bed. Once she was finished with making everything she needed, Izuku moved the bed into position so she could crash into it, moaning in pain. "God, I hate making so much at once. You don't mind putting everything else in position, do you?" Izuku smiled at her sympathetically as he began to set everything up in a cohesive manner. It was no small feat, but he had already moved an entire beach of furniture, so it wasn't much of a challenge. Once he was finished, he turned back to Momo and realized she had fallen asleep. Making sure she wasn't being suffocated by her sheets, he walked out of the room quietly, bumping into Iida, who was standing over him with a grim look on his face. "Hello Midoriya, I trust you used protection." He blanched at his friend's accusation before furiously motioning to be quiet. "Look Iida, I didn't do that to Momo. I just helped get her into bed and did her furniture wait no." Iida's eyes welled up in what he assumed to be pride as the older boy put his hands on his shoulders and exclaimed, "You mean to say you were a gentleman? You really are a paragon of masculinity and heroism, my friend. I apologize for such heinous accusations." All of a sudden, he heard a thud and Iida collapsed to the floor into unconsciousness. Izuku saw Mizo standing behind him with his hand held up in a chopping motion. "Are you okay Midoriya?" He seemed pretty boisterous. Izuku nodded at him in relief, rubbing the back of his head. "Thanks Mizo. Everyone seems to have gone crazy recently, haven't they?" Mizo shook his head, signaling that something was amiss. "No Midoriya, they've always been like this. You see, it's the women." Izuku leaned forward, interested in the quiet boy's claim. "The girls. What are they doing?" Mizo looked up and down the corridors before offering him into his own room, which Izuku took. The room itself was completely bare, leaving a single mattress and tiny desk. Izuku asked him, "Are you sure you have everything you need?" The tall boy scoffed and spoke out with one mouth. "The 4 leaves of justice." The walls seemed to shunt before they segmented and flipped. Izuku stood in awe as the room became nothing short of a bunker, complete with fridge, drawer, and a wall of plans stuck up with pins. Izuku walked over to the wall and read a couple of them, realizing that all of them were about behaviors and actions the girls of the class had taken. "Do you see what has happened to Midoriya? The women have made their move and you played right into their hands." Izuku scratched his head as Mizo came forward and pointed to a picture depicting him and Toga at the mall. "You were tricked into replacing Mineta with Himiko, bolstering the females' ranks in 1A. If this pattern of replacement continues, they will outnumber us by the next sports festival. If this occurs, they will have a higher chance of taking all 3 top places, which will undermine the male lead. Once they have control of Class A, they will move on to B, C, D, and H until the entirety of UA is female-led. At first it will be the UA, then Japan, and then the world. Do you realize the implications of this Midoriya?" "Of course you do." He was shocked at the accusation, but didn't have time to respond as Mizo offered him a hand. "But I can fix this, together. The women trust you to be lenient, compliant to their will, but we can use that to our advantage. Infiltrate their ranks and find out their plans so that we may stave off them for a time. Praise Keck." Izuku held up a finger and interrupted him. "Okay, but have you considered?" With that, Izuku dashed out of the door and left Mizo in his room. "You poor boy. May God have mercy on your soul." Time skip. Izuku shakily held a new glass of water in his hands, not able to forget everything that his classmate had said in the room above. "How what?" Shaking his head he looked up and saw that most of his class had already left, leaving just Toga, Iida, Kaminari, and Mizo, and Momo upstairs. Toga got up and off the couch and skipped happily over to him. "Hey Izuku. Wanna check out my room?" Anything to get the thoughts out of his head. Nodding he followed after her as they reached her room on the top floor. She walked in and held the door open while bowing with a flourish. "Welcome lord." Grinning at her he walked in and whistled, impressed at how much was in there. Her bed was low to the floor, being naughty, but a mattress with a frame. A desk with stylized graffiti sat in the corner, complete with a lamp in the shape of a purple panda. The walls were painted in a deep burgundy, while the rest of her colors were deep purples or black. "So, what'd you think?" Izuku turned back to her and smiled. "Good job. It's a pretty nice room all in all, though I don't know how much you'll use that desk." She pouted at the jab at her work ethic before grinning predatorily and proclaiming, "Well, let's see your room. Nothing but All Might, right?" Izuku chuckled nervously. "Pretty much spot on, got some stuff for music though. Got a nice view out onto campus though, it'll be good to be able to head to the pool whenever we want though." Toga sighed and pouted again. "You realize that's just you, right? Mr. Izawa told us that you were the only one with a standing pass." His eyes went wide at the revelation. "Huh, I guess it's because I need it for my quirk training." "Wait, I never did ask. What is your quirk?" Toga walked out with him and closed the door as she said. "It lets me take on the form of someone if I ingest their blood, quirk, and all. It's kind of hard to use it in a fight, but that's why I trained my knife throwing and such." Izuku's mind flurried with possibilities at the idea of a quirk like that. So if you do something with someone's quirk, shrink something let's say, and turn into somebody else, does the shrinking persist? Or how about splicing blood together? Or… She cut him off with a quirk peck on the cheek. "Later, okay? We'll talk about it later." He noticed that behind her normal grin, there was a heavy dose of reluctance in her expression. It made sense considering how much damage her quirk had done to her life, and Izuku mentally hit himself for being insensitive about it. "Oh okay." They made their way back downstairs in silence, the air laced with tension, as Izuku continued to berate himself. Once they were there he saw Izawa standing by the door, nodding at the two of them. "Okay, that's you two here. Now it's just Yaoi Rozu and Mizo." Izuku motioned for Toga to go ahead as he turned to the teacher. I can't speak for Mizo, but Momo fell asleep after making all of the new furniture. I would recommend heading up and getting her because she looked really tired." Izawa sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Fine. Enjoy your day and wetn it." Izuku walked past him as he went up towards the girls' dorms. Once outside, he saw Toga standing by the car while tapping her foot. Opening it up with a remote key he got in after her, still marveling at the quality of the vehicle. Dark leather chairs, fully stocked, and luxurious sitting area along with a high-tech auto driving. James had told him that it was still experimental technology, along with the undesirable not allowed for civilians, but he claimed that the police force was willing to allow it in exchange for a donation. Why is the police force so corruptible? Quickly hitting the button labeled home he got into the seat across from Toga, hit the button to dim the windows, and sighed as the car began to move. She began to fidget around in her seat, causing him to do so in turn. After a couple minutes of silence Toga burst out. "I'm sorry. I'm being such a bitch about this." Izuku quickly waved her off, pointing at himself guiltily. "No. I should be the one apologizing, it was insensitive and rude and…" He didn't get the chance to add more adjectives to his word salad as Toga shuffled around the U-shaped seat to sit next to him, laying her head in his lap. I know you like your quirks and you've been good to try and hold back." Izuku smiled down at her as she closed her eyes, enjoying the feeling. "Thanks. Anyways, what do you want to do tonight?" She hummed for a moment before asking. "You know what, I have no idea. Anything you wanted to do?" He shook his head and just as he did so he heard a knock on the window. Both of them were startled to say the least, and Izuku went to the windows. As he did so, he saw a grinning face peering at him from outside. The figure appeared to be on a motorcycle, her hair pink and in a punk style, and her fists covered with massive gauntlets that could cover his entire body. They both looked at each other for a moment before the woman motioned to the side of the quiet road while flashing a hero license at him. Nodding to her, he set Toga upright and walked over to the front of the car. Hitting the emergency park button he could feel the vehicle slowly come to a halt as it coasted into a free spot on the road. Opening the door, he got up and out to see the woman getting off her motorcycle and walking over to him with a now serious look on her face. "Hey kid, the name Vi, and I got a bone to pick with you. Do you have a license?" Izuku shook his head, quite terrified of the woman, as she blew a piece of bubble gum slowly and popped it. "Well, fairly certain that's against the law. You're coming with me kid." Quite mad with fear at the thought, Izuku said. You're riding a motorcycle without a helmet, heroics doesn't give you a pass out of that. Vi's eyes widened for a moment before she grinned at him. Sharp, and a pair on you too. I like you kid, what's your name? Toga climbed out of the car as he answered. Izuku Midoriya, heroics course at UA. Behind me is Toga Himiko, also in the heroics course. Vi nodded as she brought out a communicator and spoke into it. Kate got the auto with a military signal. Perps are 2 kids from UA, heroes if they're being honest. Their names are Izuku Midoriya and Toga Himiko, respond please. There was silence for a couple seconds before a voice spoke up in English. Got them Vi, they're legit. Bring them into the station and we can process them. I nodded and turned to them. Okay kids, let's get you to the station and we can get this all sorted out. Do you have any way of getting that thing to the station? Izuku pondered it for a moment before walking over to the car and looking into the screen. Typing in Mustafa Police Station, he watched as the GPS system locked the destination, now displaying various stats and the option to go. Getting back out, he turned back to Vi and said, it can take us to Mustafa Police Station, a couple miles from here. Will that be okay? Vi hummed before shaking her head lackadaisical. Yeah, but I'll need to come with you to stop a runner. Do you mind if I throw this thing into the back? Vi turned back to her motorcycle to the confused looks of Toga and Izuku, who were quickly awed as it began to fold down on itself until it was not but a large briefcase. Motioning for her to put it in the back, they got back into the car, hearing a thud as the trunk was closed before watching as Vi got into the car with them and closed the door behind her. Izuku hit the go button and felt the car begin to move. So Miss Vi, what's the problem? She boredly looked at him as she subconsciously began to mess around with her gauntlets. This stuff is property of the Institute, my agency. More accurately, it's tapping into our secret satellite system that makes it all possible, and this is a massive breach of regulation blah de blah. We're just going to have a nice little chat and see where you got the access to it, along with our own military-grade equipment. Izuku's eyes lit up as Toga leaned into his side, obviously uncomfortable at the woman's presence and annoyed at having their moment interrupted. Institute, the hero agency headed by Arcturus Waters and currently in the middle of an expansion into Japan. You're saying that All Might was able to get access to something like this? Vi whistled as she stopped fiddling around. You know your stuff kid, some kind of nerd. Also, why do you have something from Mr. Muscle as your car? Izuku made a PFFT noise at the nickname for All Might as Toga answered from under his arm. All Might is my guardian, along with one of our teachers. Izuku and him share similarities and he's boning his mom, so he got Izuku this thing. Vi burst out laughing as Izuku seemed to turn into a singularity of embarrassment from Toga's blunt assessment of the situation. Holy shit girl, that's brightened my day. Oh man, I just know that Kate's going to hate you. Anyways, pretty nice car considering. But where's the mini fridge? Izuku pointed at the roof and Vi looked up to see a suspended mini fridge just above her with bottles magnetized to keep them afloat. Jesus Christ kid. How come you get this and I get old Jaime cycle? She grabbed one and popped the top with a bottle opener locator on the tip of her massive metal finger. Vi drank in silence as Izuku began to figure out how to get out of this mess while Toga just glared out from under Izuku's arm. Eventually they reached the police station and Vi motioned for them to get out ahead of her. They did so and Vi led them inside where they saw Tsukauchi and a woman dressed in stereotypical British police uniform. She looked down at them and turned to Vi and said, "These two?" Vi grunted and nodded. "Yeah, they are. Anyways, let's just switch to Japanese and get this over with." The woman Izuku assumed to be Caitlin nodded and turned to him and spoke with an unmistakable accent. "Hello Mr. Midoriya, thank you for agreeing to meet with us, you, as well Ms. Himiko. Officer Tsukauchi tells me you're cleared for using this device." Izuku cleared his throat and nodded, saying, Yes officer. All Might said that he sorted everything out beforehand, so I assumed it wouldn't be an issue." Caitlin lifted an eyebrow, obviously skeptical. "All Might you say, the former No. 1 hero in Japan and current teacher at UA. Why of all people would he give you a highly expensive car equipped with military-grade prototype hardware to use as a first vehicle?" Tsukauchi grinned at them from behind the intimidating woman, flashing a goofy thumbs up and said, "Oh, these two are dating and All Might is Himiko's guardian, not to mention Midoriya's teacher. Toshinori tells me that he approves of Midoriya as a husband for his charge and so he's doing his best to keep him around." Caitlin turned back to him and sized him up as Toga grinned heavily, pulling Izuku's arm into her chest as the boy in question glared at the detective. "That seems less than sufficient as a reason. But if it is his technology, I suppose he is free to do as he wishes. Now then, onto our main gripe with the situation, the use of our satellite system. Every access point is a potential security breach and this seems highly frivolous as a use. I scoffed and said. No kidding, but it's not our decision, is it? I want to know why Jaime let them use the system in the first place, that'll be the reason. Caitlin was about to respond when the door busted open, revealing All Might in all his bony glory. You can't handle the truth. There was a resounding silence for a moment before All Might coughed and said. Sorry, I couldn't think of anything else. Anyways, I was made aware that my charge and her boyfriend were in trouble. Caitlin sighed and rubbed her forehead. All Might, glad to see that you could make it. If you would be so kind, could you tell us why you granted this piece of technology to a hormonal 16-year-old? All Might added a question, rubbing the back of his head with a hand not in a cast. Well, you see, I found it prudent to grant young Midoriya a boon for his assistance in the fight against my arch-nemesis. You see, as a teacher I should be rewarding heroic behavior. As such, I saw no problem with calling in a friend and granting him and my young charge the freedom to experience the world around them. Caitlin nodded, noting down the explanation down onto a pad. I see, and how did you gain access to our system? All Might put on a massive grin, but Izuku could see a bead of sweat dripping down his neck. Well, Mr. Heimerdinger proposed that he would be allowed access to young Midoriya as a test subject in exchange for access to your system. Before she could get in a word, Izuku asked Fo calmly. And what experiment was that? All Might was now furiously sweating. Well, young Midoriya. You see. There was a full 20 minutes of stuttering before he managed to swallow his fear and said. Well, he wanted to see how intense the effect of money on the teenage hormonal levels was for use in different chemical and hormonal supplements. There was another silence before Vi summed up while desperately trying to hold in a laugh. So what you're saying is that Jaime gave you access to a multi-million-pound system to see if it would make teenagers bone. Vi gave up, falling to her ass in laughter with Tsukauchi as Caitlin giggled at the reactions from the two teens in the room. Needless to say, Izuku was struck speechless as Toga happily began nuzzling into his muscles. Once the laughter had subsided, Caitlin flipped her notepad closed and sighed. Of course he did. That man would spend a day watching paint dry if it could explain thermodynamics. Apologies to you too, this was more overblown than I could imagine. Izuku nodded gratefully at her, shaking the hand she offered. It's no problem, Ms. Caitlin. If I may ask though, are you here on institute business? Her eyebrow raised in curiosity. I see you're perceptive. I'm guessing you read the article. Izuku nodded as Toga began to pay attention. Well, it wasn't entirely accurate in the interest of public peace. I'm unable to divulge much information as of now, but we have reason to suspect there has been a migration of villains to Japan in search of power left by the so-called League of Villains. The student nodded, speaking quietly with his finger over his mouth. We had heard as much. Do you think they will assault UA, as the League did? Toga stepped back, slightly off-put by her boyfriend's demeanor. Caitlin assumed a similar pose and responded. A possibility, but UA has implemented stringent security policies. We can presume that they will take action perhaps at the provisional hero license exam or maybe at a later event. There is also a high likelihood they will completely ignore heroes altogether and focus on making a profit from the civilians. Izuku responded, sharp as ever. The League was quite principled, I heard as much when their leader contacted me. They were doing it for the message, most villains do it for profit. Caitlin smiled at him before getting out of her pose. I see you're a smart one. Don't worry about it, you can be assured that the Institute will be working full-time on capturing any villains that should be our sector. I hope to see you again at some point, this has been quite pleasant. Izuku grinned at her and said, likewise, it's really cool to talk to someone on the same wavelength. She nodded with a smile and stood up, turning to the bored Vi. Come along Vi, let's get back home. It is about time for dinner after all. As if to illustrate her point, Toga's stomach rumbled loudly, drawing a chuckle from most of them which she pouted at. All Might motioned for the two to follow him, as he said. I had better come along to explain to your mother why you're late. Izuku nodded, not forgetting that he had essentially given a foreign scientist permission to spy on him and Toga when they were alone. Toga grabbed onto his arm once more and leaned into his side, sighing in happiness at the warmth. They all bundled into the Deku mobile and Izuku aimed it for home, letting the car begin to move as they waved lightly to the two police heroes as they waved back. Once they were settled, Izuku rounded on All Might who was whistling innocuously. What the hell, All Might? Does this mean there's a camera in this thing? The voice spoke out from the speaker system. Several actually, better angels. Both Izuku and Toga jumped at the voice. Toga called out angrily. And who are you, Mr. Voice? It laughed in a somewhat mad giggle before it said. Why, the creator of this fine automobile, of course. Heimerdinger at your service, young miss. All Might called out. Sorry I couldn't keep it a secret, but they were about to be arrested by Caitlin and Vi. Heimerdinger just chuckled before appearing on a screen in the window. He seemed to be as tall as Recovery Girl, with a massive head of hair, which seemed to have forgotten the concept of barber. It's no bother, I'm fairly certain that they were close enough to performing the act when that dunderhead Vi stepped in. Hello you two. Izuku looked at him blankly before the scientist was interrupted by a voice from off-screen. Hey Doc. Who are you talking to? The boy, just older than them, came into shot holding a box. He seemed to be pretty rugged, wearing a leather coat and having a crystal embedded in the gauntlet which contrasted his boyish face and blonde hair. Just some test subjects who found out I had been watching them. Say hello Ezreal, don't be rude. The boy dropped the box and pushed the scientist out of the way, introducing himself with a flourish and a roguish grin to Toga. The name's Ezreal, explorer, pathfinder, genius, ladykiller. Toga scoffed, taking the wind out of the boy's sails as Izuku growled at him. Nice to meet you, I'm Izuku, and this is Toga, my girlfriend. He didn't seem to notice his voice darkening at the final part, but Ezreal certainly did as he held up his hands in peace. Hey now, don't worry about that, I've already got myself a lady. Anyways, peace out, ciao for now, see ya. The boy walked off and Heimerdinger re-entered the shot. Well that's that. The call cut off and they were left in silence. All Might seemed to be more interested in his thoughts, so Toga took the opportunity to cuddle up next to Izuku. Toga. What's up? She smiled up at him, running her hand lightly over his chest, as she said. A girl likes it when her man defends his property. Izuku began to stammer, realizing exactly what she was talking about. He didn't get a chance to respond before the car came to a stop, leaving them outside of the building. They all piled out and walked up to the apartment where Inko greeted them before noticing Toshinori standing there. Oh. Hello Toshinori, what are you doing here? The former hero put a hand on Izuku's hair, ruffling it with a raucous laugh. Why, an explanation. Young Midoriya and Himiko were late for dinner due to my mistake. I do hope you can forgive me, laddie. Inko swooned, making Izuku and Toga recoil slightly. They continued their little verbal dance, and once they showed no signs of stopping, the two teenagers walked in ahead of them. Toga pulled Izuku into their room, giggling as she closed the door. Let's leave those two to their romantics. Izuku grinned at her, glad that the focus was away from his little outburst. No kidding. Didn't expect them to happen. I mean, I'm glad it's All Might and not. He caught himself, and Toga noticed his crestfallen expression. She walked up to him and laid a hand on his shoulder, lightly pushing him to sit down on the stripped bed. Izuku, I know it's not my place to ask, but what happened to your father? Izuku didn't respond immediately and just breathed semi-heavily. Toga sat down next to him, holding his hand in hers as she began to see some color appear in his cheeks and forehead. My dad. Toga spoke up softly. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. He cut her off and began to speak, devoid of emotion in his voice and a worrying lack of tact. My dad left us when I was diagnosed quirkless. He never calls, he never sends letters. He never divorced mom, he sends us money every month so that we don't press charges. The last thing I can remember him saying is no son of mine is going to be a fucking invalid. Honestly, I forget that I'm supposed to hate him some days. Toga wrapped her arms around him, pulling his face down into the crook of her neck as she said shakily. There's no need to hate him Izuku because I'm here. His breath caught in his throat as she stroked his hair, feeling her tears stream down his back. She continued, obviously not bothered by them. I never really knew my parents, maybe my mom. All I can remember is the face of the woman who ran my orphanage, but I kill. Izuku returned the hug, hearing her breath hitch as he stayed silent. She swallowed her breath and continued. I killed her. I watched her eyes go dull, but I was just so hungry I'm scared. What if I drain you too much? What if I hurt the girls or the league comes for me? I can't do this, I can't be a hero. Izuku squeezed her a bit harder, interrupting her. Don't say these things, please, you can't let something like that hold you down. He could feel a slight twinge as she smiled against him. Once they were done and separated, Izuku grabbed a tissue from a box on his nightstand and dried her tears. She grinned suggestively, nodding at the box to lighten the mood which he just scoffed at in mock exasperation. Once he was done, Toga asked curiously. Hey, you said that you were diagnosed as quirkless. No offense, but the whole green lightning and punching stuff seems not quirkless. Izuku laughed and leaned up against the wall. I was a late bloomer, really late. He seemed to pause for a moment before shaking his head. You know what? Screw it, you should know. I'll talk to All Might and see if we can let you in. Her curiosity obviously piqued as she crawled up to him, inadvertently giving him a nice view as she asked. What? What secret? Izuku grinned and shook her head, making a zipping motion across his mouth. Nope, not gonna tell. She was nearly on top of him at this point, making her biggest puppy eyes. Come on Izuku. I want a WWW. He made a show of fainting, making her giggle and collapse onto him. They laughed for a moment before they fell silent, basking in each other's warmth. You know Izu, we won't be able to sleep together when we head to the dorms. How's a girl supposed to cope? He was about to respond when they heard a crash along with a voice from the door. I see. They both turned in shock to see a buff All Might standing in a broken doorway, holding a familiar leaflet. While I do not condone such acts on UA's hallowed grounds, an aspiring young couple must know the facts. Your time has come, both of you read this. Izuku sighed as he made his fourth lap up and down to Gaba Beach's shoreline, the cool late summer water keeping him going as he panted. Today was the first day of the special training Izawa was giving them, but of course he just had to lose his imagination for one day. Special moves, attacks, and actions meant to give you an edge over any villain and lead you to victory. Izuku had spent most of his childhood watching Heroes, so he had a pretty intricate idea of how a special move was supposed to look and work, but he hadn't spent much time thinking about how his own was supposed to work. Looking up at the beach, he took note of a couple classmates who had followed him and ragdolled to the beach, namely Tsuyu and Kota. Izawa had been reluctant to allow them to leave the main group of them in UA, but accepted that Tsuyu would be better off in the ocean. Kota needed animals to work with, and Ragdoll wouldn't accept chaperoning his students if it didn't include Izuku. So they were put on a bus, shipped off to Dagaba Beach, and began to work on their moves. Izuku was acutely familiar with the entirety of the beach, remembering the trials of moving the trash that once saturated the beach. Ragdoll had elected to stand back from them all, bringing out a beach lounger and a bikini to sunbathe for a while. Kota was busy with his head in the water, a pair of swimming trunks on, as he screamed into the water to see if he could speak to the fish. That sounded crazy even though he knew the boy's quirk. Tsuyu was busy swimming alongside him much deeper, but had surfaced to speak to him. He had thought that he had lost her at some points, but her figure was just becoming wavy. What's up Izuku? Can't think of anything Kiro. He turned with a sheepish grin, his hair maintaining its insanity, even though it was heavy with water. Tsuyu was in the swimsuit he remembered from earlier in the summer, well he had elected to use a pair of trunks like Kota. Pretty much. I mean, my quirk is just super strength and my arms are pretty busted up. I can't work at 100%, not as I am now. She put a finger on her chin, a habit Izuku had noticed she did whenever she was debating on if something she was about to say was appropriate. Well, I think there's a bunch of stuff you could try. Remember back at the USJ? That was pretty cool from my perspective, Kiro. Izuku cast his mind back to that incident, trying to think of anything he did in particular that could be classed as cool. Remind me. She giggled as Izuku blushed. The finger flick thing Kiro. Where the villains were caught in a whirlpool. Izuku gasped as he remembered that moment, realizing that it would be perfect for a move. You're right. But how am I supposed to do that constantly? She shrugged. You've been getting better at using your quirk, right? Maybe if you were to use that full cowl thing you could make it weaker, but able to use it constantly Kiro. Good luck. But that she dove down again, intent on working on her own special move, as Izuku pondered her words. I guess it wouldn't hurt to try, but I can't use my fingers like that again, and I can't rely on my arms. Wait a minute. Time skip, 2 hours later. Oh fuck. Ragdoll, Kota, and Tsuyu were watching in fascination as Izuku ran up and down the water, not the beach, but the water, creating tiny whirlpools as he went. The boy didn't seem to have any control over his speed as he put Jesus to shame in his walking on water tactic. Kota turned to Ragdoll. Should we help Midoriya-san? They realized that they weren't listening, instead electing to take out their phones and video their classmate and friend making an idiot of himself. Kota sighed and turned around to see if anyone was watching, despairing as he saw a small armada of people watching with their cameras raised to take pictures. After about 2 more minutes Izuku finally managed to turn around, rushing onto the beach and drawing a massive line where he skidded to a halt. Tsuyu lowered her camera and ran over to him, acting as if she hadn't just taken a video of his greatest embarrassment. Izuku Kiro. Are you okay? He was face down in the sand, the soles of his feet looking as if they had been rubbed with sandpaper. No shit, as he gave no response. She knelt down next to him, mindful of the crowds of people. Izuku. Are you okay? She was startled as he instantly jumped to his feet. Legs. The answer is legs. There was no time to question him as he turned to her and excitedly put his hands on her shoulders. Legs Tsu, legs. She blinked. Legs. He nodded frantically. Legs. Thank you for helping me think of legs. She was caught off guard by a peck on the lips from the excitable. Caught breathless, she didn't have time to respond as he ran off down the beach. Ragdoll and Kota caught up with her as Tsuyu held her hand up to her lips. Asui, you okay? Only one word crossed her lips as she stared out at her crush. Legs. Time skip. Nobody had seen much of Izuku after the incident. Sayu had kept her mouth shut to their classmates, but Toga had figured out as much as she needed from her demeanor and Kota's reluctant willingness to tell her. Everybody had seen the videos on the internet, but nothing much had come of it except some chuckles and passing comments when they saw their classmate coming in at 11 p.m. Sayu was often gone at the same time as him, but when the behavior was raised to Toga during gossip she just grinned, stating, "I mean, I don't blame him. A tongue like that. That kept them up at night." Izawa had continued to allow the 3 students to train at the GABA under the watchful eye of Ragdoll, but pulled them back after another 2 days into their 5-day course when he saw the tomfoolery going on online. Izuku was still scarce even in the gym, but people had seen him in the corner, bouncing around the pillars of rock like an overexcited pinball. On the final day, everyone was in full swing. Mina was busy with her sticking acid, Aoyama was using his laser to shoot down falling debris, Kirishima had begun headbutting rocks to break them, all in all it was a glorious mess. Toga was the talk of the class though. Her quirk was suited to getting her hands dirty, a bad quality for a hero, but a certain engineer had managed to pull through for her. Her new rig consisted of sewing needle-sized darts which connected through near microscopic tubes back to her, designed not to do lasting damage. If she wanted, she could instantly mimic an opponent with just one hit or deliver a paralyzing poison by coating one of the darts. She had wanted to keep her original villain costume, but after seeing some of the designs May had presented to her, she acquiesced pretty easily. The former villain was now sporting a suit stylized to look like a vampire while still being maneuverable. There was no skirt, instead opting for a conforming suit which incorporated the rig into her waist belt. Some of the guys, namely Kaminari, had made a pass at her, but she just laughed them off with an insult to their manhood. Honestly, she wasn't sure what Izuku was up to. He had, of course, met with her at dinner to top off her blood, but they never really talked much considering she was drinking the entire time and he ran off when she was finished. That's what led her to train just next to his area on the final day, practicing her throwing technique until she was able to hit 3 targets simultaneously. She had heard him mumbling to himself loudly, but couldn't get a good view of him as he was constantly jumping around above her. Toga heard a small sneeze to her side and turned to see a wall with a slight discoloration, which turned into the curvaceous form of Tsuyu climbing on the wall. "Oh, hey Toga-chan, Kiro." Toga blinked before asking. "Tsu? What was that?" Tsuyu waved her off, getting back onto 2 feet as she responded. "My new move, camouflage. I'm also working on a poison, but I don't have the stomach for it yet, Kiro." Toga nodded and held up 3 needles, fanning them softly as she said. "I'm getting better at using these things, but I don't really have a feel for how they work against someone." They stood in silence for a moment before Tsuyu just sighed and held her arms behind her back. "I'll do it, Kiro. Just please be gentle." Toga smiled at her sweetly, with no malice, but a hint of reluctance. "Okay Tsu, I promise this won't hurt a bit." Before Tsuyu could close her eyes and brace herself, she felt a quick sting in her arm before it dulled considerably. Blinking, she looked up to see a carbon copy of herself, suit and all, standing in front of herself. Man, May was right about this suit. This is better than the geezer could ever make. Tsu put a finger on her chin, wondering what to say before sweat dropping when Tsu Toga mimicked her and her typical hunch. Kiro, what can you do?" Tsu Toga let her fly out, taking a lick of Tsu's cheek. The girl in question blushed as Tsu Toga said despite the lolling tongue. "Depends how advanced your quirk is. Remember, your body is mine for now. I know everything, and damn girl you feel good." They were interrupted by a cough from a voice both of them knew quite well, and both turned in sync to look at Ragdoll and Izuku looking at them in confusion. Their mutual crush looked between them for a while before asking, "What's going on?" Tsuyu said calmly. "Just helping Toga-chan with her training, yourself Kiro." Of course Toga went for another route. "Testing out some new ideas for the bedroom, you like?" Ragdoll PFFT''D, as Izuku lost all semblance of dignity. Tsuyu didn't make the situation any better by putting her finger on her chin thoughtfully and saying, "Doesn't sound like a bad idea Kiro." Once they had sobered up they talked about their progress, Izuku staying silent about his new upgrades on his leg guards as they compared notes. Eventually they heard a voice call over to them. "Hello, young Midoriya. I trust you have been well." Izuku turned to see All Might walking towards him with a smile, waving thoughtlessly, as though he hadn't walked into a warzone of superheroes. Luckily, they were far enough away from everyone for there not to be any danger. "All Might. What's up?" Toga changed back into her original form, as the former number 1 explained. "Well, it's simply a visit to see how you have been doing with your quirk." Izuku nodded, as Toga smiled contentedly. She had already heard the tale of One for All, and how Izuku had been chosen to inherit the sacred torch. "Just fine sir, I've been thinking about how I've been using it, and He felt somebody whisper into his ear. legs or dumb. Eyes widened, pupils dilated, and buttocks clenched, Izuku didn't take a second to charge full cowling and began to pinball off the wall. Everybody turned to where he was standing to see Ragdoll struggling to contain a laugh, which they all joined in on. Eventually Izuku calmed down, jumping back down to the ground and petulantly ignoring Ragdoll. The woman tried to coax him into speaking with her with an apology and a couple promises, but he didn't relent, causing her to pout sadly. All Might gave his final thoughts on the new style, complimenting Izuku on finding his own way before walking off to talk to Jiru. Ragdoll gave up trying to reconcile with Izuku, saying goodbye to Toga and Tsuyu before walking over to stand with Aizawa and Ectoplasm. Aizawa smirked at her and asked, "What's wrong?" She glared at him, knowing full well that he was teasing her. "Shut up, I don't like the cold shoulder." He scoffed before turning back to the class, watching vigilantly as Bakugo destroyed a rock with a targeted blast and causing some rubble to tumble down the cliffside. "Well, that's your fault, isn't it?" Ragdoll pouted again, weakly refuting. "It was just a joke, not that you'll ever need to worry about that though, eh, lover boy?" Aizawa boredly looked at her, no sign of emotion in his eyes except boredom. "What are you talking about?" Ectoplasm piped up. "Shota, we all know that Mandalay visits Ragdoll on the weekends. But against common logic, after we see her leave Ragdoll's dormitory, she walks up towards the male dorms. Do you honestly think we cannot put two and two together?" They might have gotten a reaction out of him if they were in the presence of his friend, but in his current state, the teacher just sighed. "You act like that's something to be worked up about, Shino, and I go back a long time, and we're just friends. You, on the other hand, Ragdoll, cannot go a day without checking up on Midoriya." Ragdoll grinned and put her hands on her hips. "Hey, I'm a fully grown woman in a sea of insane people. Also, I wanna see if I can get Izukiden to join the Pussycats." Before Aizawa could stop him, Ectoplasm asked why. A large sinister grin stretched over her face. "Why, costumes of course. Keeping him tied down, fitting him for a marching band uniform, getting him a tail." The two men fell green at the thought. Aizawa grimaced at the thought of having Shino dress him up in the Pussycats uniform and suddenly felt a duty to keep Ragdoll away from Izuku, a duty, as an educator of course. Moving swiftly on. They all turned to see Nezu standing there with an older man and a woman in a police uniform with a rifle. His face was hardened, well-kept facial hair grayed and suit perfectly laundered. Nezu pointed up to the man and said, "Aizawa-sensei, please meet Mr. Winters and Caitlin. They will be working with us as representatives of the institute." Winters nodded to him as Caitlin looked out over the class, examining each of them until her eyes landed on a certain Midoriya. They all turned to her and she explained, "Oh, I recognized one of your students, apologies." Aizawa waved her off and turned around, shouting, "Midoriya, get over here." The student said goodbye to the Tutsuyas before charging full cowl and jumping from rock to rock. He skidded to a halt in front of his teacher and asked, "What can I help you with?" He turned to allow him to see the two visitors, which caused Izuku to perk up. "Ms. Caitlin. What are you doing here? Also hello Mr. Winters." The old man praised the young student imperiously for a moment before saying, "Hello Mr. Midoriya, as I understand it you and Caitlin share a shallow history." The student nodded as Caitlin cleared her throat and said with a slight smile, "Yes sir, we had a run-in concerning the discrepancy in our engineering department. As I recall it, he was roped into one of Heimerdinger's experiments." Winters hemmed before nodding and extending his hand to the young boy. "I see, it is a pleasure to meet someone who caused Caitlin to give such glowing reviews about." Caitlin spluttered as Izuku clasped the man's hand and he could see a glint of mischief in the old man's eyes as he said, "Likewise sir, what brings you here?" "Institute business." He let go and motioned at the rest of his class as Ragdoll glared at Caitlin, who was somewhat returning the sentiment. "Examining the current stock of heroes in training of course. I hear you have done research into our agency." Izuku nodded and Nezu looked on happily at the participation. "Yes, sir. Institute was established 20 years ago as a government-sponsored hero organization and special operatives branch of the armed forces. Over the years it has grown into a somewhat all-encompassing hero agency for Britain, allowing taxes and payment to be consolidated. From what I hear, you are currently engaged in a large-scale operation in the Scottish Highlands against a terrorist jinx who hasn't been sighted in weeks." An eyebrow was raised on the old man's wrinkled forehead. "Oh? And what do you think of the situation with Jinx?" Izuku grimaces, forgetting about the adults with eyes on him. "She is a 20-year-old villain, quirk. Hexavant. Using a material that is exclusive to British territories, Jinx is able to create most anything out of it, considering its omnipotent usefulness. She destroyed 1/4 of Manchester, half of Dublin, and was last sighted attempting to rig a bomb to go off in Aberdeen, which was projected to destroy 4 buildings and kill 300 people. Winters nodded as Aizawa grinned satisfied, glad that his student was so studious. I see you really know your stuff then. I'm certain you're aware, but we must require the utmost discretion in the matter. The boy nodded solemnly before Winters began again, now looking at Aizawa. You seem to be a good teacher, it is a pleasure to meet you Mr. Aizawa. Aizawa nodded before turning to Izuku again. Midoriya, you can go back to training now. A small cough interjected, and they all turned to look at Caitlin. I was wondering what you were practicing, as a technique. Izuku grinned and motioned down to his legs, now adorned in metallic guards. Working on a new way of fighting, I call it shoot style. She nodded, obviously impressed, as Ragdoll fumed at the woman. I see. Perhaps I could test the limits of this shoot style. Perhaps a small wager. There was a resounding call of disapproval from the other teachers before Izuku grinned and nodded. Name your terms. Caitlin grinned, bringing up her rifle. I have a single magazine, 6 rounds, all stunning bullets. If you dodge all of them, I'll take you in for an internship. I win, you offer yourself for one of Heimerdinger's test drives. Mr. Winters felt Nezu tug at his leg and asked. Archeress, why are you so lenient with your bodyguard? This seems wholly inappropriate. He smiled, his lips cracking upwards at the corners, as he said. Because we want him to succeed, and Caitlin is one of our best marksmen. I doubt he will succeed, but there is no loss for us if he does. They turned back to see that most of the class had gathered around to watch them despite Aizawa's protests. Ragdoll had given up, sitting to the side dejectedly, as she watched Izuku smile while ignoring her. Who the hell is this woman? Butting in like a butt. Nezu cleared his throat before calling out a countdown. Izuku's body lit up in green lightning. Caitlin looked down her scope, aiming for his center of mass. 3, 2, 1 go. Izuku jumped as hard as he could, letting the dart fly through his legs before twisting in the air to avoid the follow-up. He turned his head to see Caitlin still aiming at him, her finger close to twitching on the trigger as he bounced off the roof to avoid another dart. 3 down, 3 to go, come on. They continued that dance for another 2 darts, but he realized something as he looked at Caitlin again. Her face was twisted into a calm grin, and his heart sank when he realized she had been holding back. He was in mid-flight, her finger was hovering over the trigger, but a strategy came into his head. It was crazy, but it might just work. Bouncing off a rock face, he didn't jump off in the direction he normally would, but instead aimed straight for her. The trigger was pulled, the dart flew, it was a centimeter from his face. Is this a tie? The dart had hit him right between the eyes, and the stunning agent instantly got to work, but it was too late to dodge him. He barreled right into her, bringing both down to the ground with a crash. Once the dust had cleared, Class A could all see their resident pinball draped on top of the strange hero, completely rigid, as they were both on the ground. Winters began to chuckle, as most of them began to crack up at the scene, while Caitlin tried to push the boy off to no avail. Eventually Ragdoll huffed and stomped forward, grabbing Izuku and pulling him off. His body was still completely rigid, the dart having fallen from his forehead. Caitlin stood up, nodding to Ragdoll before rubbing the area of her back she had landed on. Well, that was interesting. Aizawa sighed as he glared at the cheering class, signaling for them to get back to work. This was way too predictable. Midoriya has a slightly suicidal streak when it comes to being in a corner. Winter's eyebrows went up again. You mean that he was able to detect when Caitlin stopped holding back? Aizawa nodded, hiding a grin of pride. Most likely. He has a history of pulling out a strategy for the sole purpose of sending his enemy off balance. If anything, he would have thought about how it would play out in a real situation. Caitlin nodded, finally finished rearranging her clothes, as she said. Assuming this was during a fight, there could have been other heroes present or civilians. It would have led to him either buying time, providing an opening, or outright knocking me out and letting civilians contact the authorities. It wasn't sound, but it was the only option against a superior opponent. Anyways, we should allow Midoriya some time to rest and allow the agent to run its course. It can last up to 10 hours depending on the size of the target, and this looks like a strong 8. Ragdoll interrupted before anybody could object. I'll take him. Nezu nodded, giving her the clear for taking him, which she gleefully did. As she left, Aizawa turned to Caitlin curiously. So, what are you going to do about that bet? The marksman smirked, looking at the boy being carried off. Oh, that was an empty wager. The teacher's eyes went wide. What do you? The grin across her face told him everything he needed. I heard from my brother about him when I asked. He's supposed to be a quick learner with a hell of a lucky streak. Considering that, along with him already being familiar with our agency, it would be a simple matter to bring him for an internship. I always intended to see if he would be worth picking up, and being an intern with us automatically entails being one of Heimerdinger's test subjects. Everything worked out and nothing was lost. Unfortunately, the knock from the fall along with the area my dart hit makes it possible that he lost all recollection of the fight. The scheming grin on her face gave all of the UA teachers the shivers, but they didn't notice a certain invisible frog girl on the wall, listening into everything. Sayu scrambled back up the cliff face to see Toga and Ichako watching the entire proceedings. Ichako took the initiative, asking worriedly. "What's wrong, Tsu? What happened to Deku?" She turned back visible before saying worriedly. "I don't know, but it doesn't sound like good news for Izuku Kiro." Toga grimaced, playing with one of her needles. "So what do we do? He ain't going into this without knowing what he's getting into, not on my watch." They all stood around in a circle, wondering about what they were going to do to keep Izuku away from Caitlyn. "You know, I think I have an idea. It might be crazy, Kiro, but I think I have an idea." Toga and Ichako turned to Sayu, who was busy thinking. "What is it?" Sayu looked up, her eyes dead serious, as she said. "May. Offchange time skip, savior of storytelling." Izuku groaned as he sat up, reflexively putting a hand to his head as he tried to stave off the stinging in his brain. He looked around in the relative darkness to see that the room had mostly been decorated in pastel greens and yellows. Small manga cats covered the walls, while the bedding he was in appeared to be covered by a massive cat head. 3 guesses who this is. A small knock was heard from the door and it opened to reveal Ragdoll in a set of pajamas while holding up a green version of them. She said excitedly. "Izu kitty. Come on." She bounded over to the bed, grabbing his hand and pulling him up before pushing the clothes into his arms. "Pix just got here. Come on, this is gonna be great." She left before he could ask anything, leaving him in the room alone once again. He didn't really remember what had happened, but he must have been abducted by Ragdoll in his sleep for purposes of sleepovers. Is this legal? Probably. Shrugging off his hero clothes, he got into the lightweight green pajamas and walked out of the room, hanging the old clothes over a chair. The light was uncomfortable, but he could see a common room along with 3 other figures. Ragdoll preparing various snacks at a kitchenette, Pixie Bob lying on a sofa with a remote in hand while scrolling through a movie streaming service along with Midnight browsing through her phone on a beanbag. Pixie Bob noticed him come through the door and grinned. "Hey Midoriya. Long time no see." He waved back awkwardly as Midnight looked up, licking her lips dangerously before saying. "Nice to see somebody's up, big shot." Izuku blinked before asking. "Big shot? What happened?" Midnight giggled evilly as she said. "Don't remember? You challenged Caitlyn the Deadeye in a test of speed. Seriously, what were you thinking?" As he sat down on the sofa he asked. "Caitlyn the Deadeye? You mean the hero from the institute?" She nodded, explaining. "Yeah, that Caitlyn. Her quirk is insane, critical. It's supposed to let her slow down her perception for a couple seconds at the expense of massive amounts of energy and fatigue. Her rifle skills are legendary in the hero community. Snipe is her brother, but he just got instinctive aiming." Izuku pondered that for a moment. "Ms. Caitlyn is that talented? I'll have to apologize to her the next time I see her, she must have seen it as an insult." Ragdoll walked back over excitedly, holding multiple bowls of popcorn and other snacks. "This is gonna be awesome. What have you got, Pix?" Pixie Bob grinned up at her as she said. "No fucking clue cause the title's font is stupid, but it looks pretty good. Supposed to be a horror flick about some cruise ship." They all nodded and got into comfortable positions, but somehow Izuku ended up with Pixie Bob's head in his lap. Ragdoll caught his eye and grinned supportingly, flashing him a thumbs up before the title card rolled. Surprisingly, Izuku enjoyed the movie despite the uncomfortable feeling of Pixie Bob jumping every time there was a jump scare. Ragdoll was struggling to contain her laughter as Izuku shifted uncomfortably while Pixie Bob tried to get as close as possible, hiding her eyes from the screen. Eventually the climax of the action began, causing Pixie Bob to begin to shiver in fear. It was kinda funny to Izuku, but it was also kinda weird when she cried out while looping her arms around his midriff. Midnight and Ragdoll laughed as their student tried to pry the woman double his age off of him. Eventually he gave up, turning back to the movie with a sigh and not noticing the roguish grin Pixie Bob had adopted at her success. The movie ended and Izuku went to pry off Pixie Bob but began to panic when he saw she had fallen asleep. Ragdoll laughed and turned the lights back on, revealing that she was looking pretty fine considering the movie. "Pix, get off him. He's like half your age." Midnight butted in with a dangerous smile. "Nothing wrong with it, Rag, I'm not hearing a no in any case." Izuku tried to push her off to no avail, only succeeding in making her tighten her grip. In his efforts he noticed that her clothes were becoming dangerously strained, causing him to stop and look at Ragdoll with pleading eyes. She shook her head with a mischievous grin as Midnight yawned dramatically. Well, I should probably get going myself. Thanks for inviting Rag. Ragdoll grinned happily at her before moving over to her own room. Likewise, night Midnight. Izuku, don't do anything I wouldn't do. She flicked the lights off again, leaving with Midnight and leaving Izuku with the sleeping Pixie Bob. He looked down at her with a sigh, realizing he wouldn't be able to escape without inviting her ire. Resting his head back he sat in the quiet, the only sound being Pixie Bob snoring, as he dreaded the sleepless night he was about to have. Of change. Sai knocked on the door of the development studio, as Uraraka and Toga kept vigil over the corridors, terrified that a teacher or guard would appear to bust them. Sue has assured them that it was all a part of the plan, but the dangers associated with it were great. The door opened ominously, mist swirling at their feet as they peered in. They saw a figure sat on a veritable throne of scraps and inventions. Toga could make out her pink hair hanging down to her shoulders, covering her eyes as she fiddled with a spanner. The figure looked up to the three, beckoning them in quickly before the door shut. I've been expecting you three. I know what you want and I have it. Sai gulped before saying. May, do you think you can help us out with this, Kiro? We're willing to help you out in return with something. May grinned, grabbing a random invention from her pile and tossing it between her hands. I want in. I've heard about this Heimerdinger guy and he ain't going to butt into my market. In return, I reckon I could get some upgrades done to your rooms and costumes. Now then, shall we begin? All three gulped as May went over to the spare costumes closet, grabbing their costumes, a notepad and pen. This was going to be a long night. The end. Thanks for watching my video and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.